On the night of the 11th of December 1936, a former king sat before a microphone at Windsor Castle and spoke to the world. He had reigned for less than 11 months, and now he was giving it all up, renouncing the throne of a global empire, and he explained his decision in words that would become some of the most famous ever spoken by a British royal. He had found it impossible, he said, to carry the heavy burden of his duties without the help and support of the woman he loved. With that broadcast, the legend was born. The legend of the king who gave up his throne for love, the romantic story of a man who sacrificed a crown rather than abandon the woman he could not live without. It is a story that has been told and retold for nearly a century, the great romance of the 20th century monarchy, the king who chose love over duty. And it is a story that is, in its essential framing, profoundly misleading, because the documented reality of Edward VIII is far more complicated and far less flattering than the romantic legend allows. The real Edward was a man who, by the testimony of those who knew him and the judgment of the historians who have studied him, was temperamentally unsuited to the throne from his earliest childhood, a man who never wanted the burden of kingship and who confessed to his own brother that he could not bear it. He was a king who neglected his duties, who left the secret papers of state lying about for foreign diplomats and his married mistress to see, who treated the discretion his position demanded as something beneath him. He was a man whose political sympathies were so troubling that some historians have argued the country was fortunate to be rid of him before the war that was coming. And he was a man for whom the abdication was, as much as a sacrifice, an escape, the way out of a role he had failed at and did not want, the release from a burden he had never been able to carry. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The story that the affair with a married American cost Edward the throne is true only in the narrowest sense, because the deeper truth inverts the romance entirely. The throne was not something Edward lost to love, but something he was failing to hold, a burden he was ill-suited to bear and arguably glad to set down. And the woman he married gave him not only a reason to abandon it, but a means of escape from a job he could not do. This is the real story of Edward VIII, the glamorous prince who could not, or would not, be a king. To understand why Edward VIII abandoned his throne, and why so many who knew him were unsurprised that he did, you have to begin with the making of the man, with the cold and formal childhood that shaped him, and with the signs, visible from his earliest years, that he was ill-suited to the role he had been born to fill. The Edward who gave up his crown in 1936 was, in significant part, the product of his upbringing, and that upbringing did much to create the restless, emotionally starved, and unsuited man who would, in the end, walk away from the throne. Edward was born on the 23rd of June, 1894, the eldest child of the Duke and Duchess of York, the couple who would in time become King George V and Queen Mary. He was born into the direct line of succession, the great-grandson of Queen Victoria, and when his father became king in 1910, Edward became the heir to the throne, created Prince of Wales the following year. From his birth, then, Edward was marked for the crown, raised in the knowledge that he would one day be king, his entire life shaped by the expectation of the throne that awaited him. He was the heir, the future king, and everything about his upbringing was directed toward the role he would one day assume, the preparation of a boy to become the sovereign of a global empire. The father who shaped Edward's upbringing, King George V, was a man of rigid discipline and conventional values, a stern and demanding figure who ran his household with the strictness of the naval officer he had been. George V was a man of duty and routine, conservative in his values, rigid in his expectations, a father who demanded discipline and conformity from his children. He was not a warm or affectionate father, but a distant and demanding one, ruling his household with a strictness that left little room for warmth or indulgence. There is a remark often attributed to George V that captures the spirit of his approach to fatherhood, an expression of his belief that his children should fear him as he had feared his own father, the deliberate cultivation of a stern and intimidating paternal authority. Whether or not the exact words are accurate, they capture the reality of the upbringing that George V provided, a cold and demanding regime of discipline and duty, a household ruled by a stern and distant father who demanded much and offered little in the way of warmth or affection. The effect of this cold and demanding upbringing on Edward was significant, shaping a boy who grew up emotionally starved, hungry for the warmth and affection that his upbringing had denied him. Edward grew up in the shadow of his stern and distant father, subjected to the cold discipline of the royal household, deprived of the warmth and affection that a child needs. The emotional deprivation of his upbringing left its mark, creating a boy and then a man who was emotionally needy, hungry for the warmth and the reassurance that his cold upbringing had failed to provide. This emotional neediness, this hunger for warmth and affection, would prove significant in Edward's later life, shaping the man who would become so dependent on the women in his life, who would crave the warmth and the reassurance and the strong guiding presence that his cold upbringing had denied him. The emotional deprivation of Edward's childhood thus did much to create the needy and dependent man he would become, the hunger for warmth and affection that his cold upbringing had bred shaping his character and his relationships for the rest of his life. The signs that Edward was temperamentally unsuited to the role he had been born to fill were visible from his earliest years, the boy showing little aptitude for the qualities that his future position would demand. From early childhood, Edward showed signs of being ill-suited to the throne that awaited him, lacking the temperament and the aptitude that the role of king would require. He showed little scholastic promise, no great intellectual aptitude, none of the studiousness or the seriousness that his future position might have demanded. He was not by temperament a serious or a disciplined or a studious boy, but a restless and a pleasure-seeking one, lacking the gravity and the application that the role of king would require. These early signs, the lack of scholastic promise and the restless and pleasure-seeking temperament, were visible from Edward's childhood, the indications that he was ill-suited to the throne, apparent from his earliest years, the boy lacking the qualities that his future position would demand. The formal education that Edward received did little to prepare him for his future role, the harsh and unsuitable schooling failing to instill the qualities that his position would require. In 1907, at the age of 13, Edward was enrolled in the Naval College, sent to be educated in the stern and disciplined environment of the naval training establishment. The Naval College was a harsh place, marked by a brutal and unforgiving discipline, and Edward, the heir to the throne, was treated no differently from the other boys, subjected to the same harsh regime, the same bullying and hardship that the other cadets endured. The naval education was a stern and unforgiving one, and it did little to prepare Edward for the role of king, instilling neither the intellectual development nor the breadth of understanding that his future position might have demanded. The harsh schooling of the Naval College, the brutal discipline, and the narrow naval training failed to provide Edward with the education that his future role required, the unsuitable schooling doing little to prepare the heir for the throne that awaited him. The First World War, which broke out when Edward was 20, gave him an experience that would shape his sympathies, but that also reflected the constraints and the frustrations of his position. When the war broke out in 1914, Edward, eager to serve, was commissioned in the army, joining the Grenadier Guards. But he was not permitted to fight on the front line, because the heir to the throne could not be risked in the fighting, his life too valuable to be exposed to the dangers of combat. Edward served instead as a staff officer, kept away from the front-line fighting, performing duties behind the lines, frustrated by his inability to share fully in the dangers that other young men faced. This experience, the frustration of being kept from the front-line fighting, marked Edward, the heir denied the chance to share fully in the war that his generation was fighting. But the war also gave Edward an exposure to the common soldiers, an experience of the men who fought and suffered and died that would shape his sympathies, fostering in him a genuine concern for the ordinary men whose hardships he had witnessed. The war thus shaped Edward in two ways, reflecting the constraints of his position in the frustration of being kept from the fighting, and shaping his sympathies through his exposure to the common soldiers whose hardships he had seen. The combination of factors that shaped Edward's formation, the cold upbringing, and the emotional deprivation, and the early signs of unsuitedness, and the harsh and unsuitable education, created the man who would become king, and it created a man poorly equipped for the role. Edward emerged from his formation an emotionally needy man, hungry for the warmth and affection that his cold upbringing had denied him. He emerged temperamentally unsuited to the throne, lacking the gravity and the discipline and the application that the role of king would require. He emerged poorly educated for his position, the harsh naval schooling having failed to provide the intellectual development and the breadth of understanding that his future role demanded. And he emerged restless and pleasure-seeking, drawn to indulgence and excitement rather than to the duty and the discipline that his position would require. The man who would become Edward VIII was thus, by his formation, poorly equipped for the throne, an emotionally needy and temperamentally unsuited and poorly educated man, shaped by a cold upbringing and an unsuitable education into a figure ill-prepared for the role he had been born to fill. There is a particular significance in recognizing how early the signs of Edward's unsuitedness were visible, because it bears on the question of whether the abdication was the aberration it is often taken to be, or the culmination of a long apparent unsuitedness. The Romantic legend treats the abdication as a tragic departure from an otherwise promising reign, the unfortunate consequence of an impossible love. But the recognition of how early and how clearly the signs of Edward's unsuitedness were visible suggests a different understanding, the abdication as the culmination of a long apparent unsuitedness rather than a tragic aberration. The boy who showed from his earliest years that he was ill-suited to the throne, the emotionally needy and restless and pleasure-seeking heir who lacked the qualities his position demanded, grew into the man who would abandon the throne, and the abandonment was, in this light, the culmination of a long apparent unsuitedness rather than a sudden and tragic departure. The early signs of Edward's unsuitedness thus bear on the deeper understanding of the abdication, suggesting that it was the fulfillment of a long apparent unfitness rather than the tragic aberration that the Romantic legend supposes. The formation of Edward, then, created a man poorly equipped for the throne, and the signs of his unsuitedness, visible from his earliest years, anticipated the abandonment that was to come. The cold upbringing and the emotional deprivation, the early signs of unsuitedness, and the harsh and unsuitable education created the emotionally needy and temperamentally unsuited man who would, in time, walk away from the throne. And the early visibility of his unsuitedness, the clarity with which the signs were apparent from his childhood, anticipated the abandonment that was to come. The boy who was ill-suited to the throne, growing into the man who would abandon it. The making of Edward thus did much to create the man who would give up his crown, the formation that produced an emotionally needy and temperamentally unsuited figure, anticipating the abandonment that would, in the end, fulfill the unsuitedness that had been apparent from his earliest years. How this poorly equipped and emotionally needy man became, in the 1920s, the most glamorous and popular figure in the world, the dazzling Prince of Wales whose charm concealed the flaws that would later destroy his reign, is where the story turns next. Because before the abdication, before the crisis, Edward was the most celebrated prince of his age, a figure of extraordinary glamour and popularity, and the gap between that dazzling public image and the flawed man beneath it is essential to understanding the abdication that was to come. That glamorous prince, and the flaws beneath the glamour, is where we go now. Before he was the king who abandoned his throne, Edward was the most glamorous and celebrated figure in the world, the dazzling Prince of Wales whose charm and style made him the idol of his age. The gap between this dazzling public image and the flawed man beneath it is one of the central truths of his story, because the glamour that made Edward so popular concealed the shallowness and the unsuitedness that would, in time, destroy his reign. To understand the abdication, you have to understand both the genuine glamour of the Prince of Wales and the emptiness that lay beneath it. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Edward, as Prince of Wales, became the most famous and celebrated young man in the world, a figure of extraordinary glamour and popularity. He was, by the measure of his time, a celebrity of the first rank, the most photographed person of his age, his image reproduced in newspapers and magazines around the world, his every move followed by an adoring public. He was handsome and charming and stylish, the embodiment of a certain modern glamour, the dashing young prince who seemed to capture the spirit of his age. His popularity was immense, rivaling and perhaps exceeding that of any prince before him. the adoring public following his every move with a fascination that anticipated the celebrity culture of later decades. Edward was, in the 1920s, the great celebrity of his age, the most famous and glamorous young man in the world, the dazzling Prince of Wales whose image captivated the public and whose every move was followed with adoration. Edward's influence on the fashion of his age was one of the marks of his celebrity, the prince setting the styles that men around the world sought to emulate. He was a noted figure of fashion, his style of dress admired and copied, his sartorial choices setting the trends that fashionable men followed. He gave his name to a particular style of knotting a tie, the fashion item that bore his title, a lasting if minor legacy of his influence on the styles of his age. During his visits abroad, his clothes attracted as much attention as the man himself, observers noting that young men everywhere sought to emulate the style of the Prince of Wales. This influence on fashion, the setting of the styles that men around the world sought to copy, was one of the marks of Edward's celebrity, the prince a figure of fashion whose sartorial choices shaped the trends of his age, his style admired and emulated by fashionable men everywhere. The role that Edward played as Prince of Wales, the goodwill ambassador who toured the empire and represented his father around the world, was one that he performed with genuine success, his charm and his glamour making him an effective representative of the crown. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Edward undertook many tours of the empire and the wider world, representing his father and the monarchy abroad, serving as a goodwill ambassador for the crown. He toured the dominions and the colonies, visited foreign countries, traveled widely as the representative of the British monarchy, his tours attracting enormous attention and acclaim. And he performed this role with genuine success, his charm and his glamour and his easy manner making him an effective and popular representative of the crown, the dashing Prince of Wales charming the crowds and winning goodwill for the monarchy wherever he went. The role of goodwill ambassador suited Edward's gifts, his charm, and his glamour, making him an effective representative, and he performed it with a success that added to his popularity and his celebrity, the dazzling prince winning acclaim for the monarchy through his tours of the empire and the world. One of the most genuinely admirable aspects of Edward's record as Prince of Wales was his concern for the disadvantaged, his evident sympathy for the veterans of the war and the unemployed of the Depression. Edward showed a genuine concern for the hardships of the ordinary people, visiting the poverty-stricken areas of Britain, expressing sympathy for the unemployed, taking an interest in the welfare of the disadvantaged. He had been moved by his exposure to the common soldiers during the war, and this sympathy extended, in his years as Prince of Wales, to the veterans of that war and to the unemployed who suffered in the hardship of the Depression. He visited the distressed areas, met the unemployed, expressed his concern for their hardships, lending his support to schemes intended to help them find work. This concern for the disadvantaged was one of the genuinely admirable aspects of Edward's record, the prince showing a real sympathy for the hardships of the ordinary people, his evident concern for the veterans and the unemployed winning him a genuine following among those whose hardships he acknowledged. The sympathy was real, and it added to Edward's popularity, the dazzling prince showing a genuine concern for the disadvantaged that distinguished him in the eyes of the public. And yet, beneath the glamour and the charm and the genuine sympathy, there was a shallowness to Edward, a superficiality that those who observed him closely came to recognize. The sympathy that Edward showed for the disadvantaged, genuine as it was also superficial, a spontaneous and easy sympathy that lacked depth or real substance. He could feel and express a genuine concern for the hardships he witnessed, but the concern was shallow, a passing sympathy that did not translate into sustained commitment or real understanding. The charm that made him so popular was, similarly, a surface quality, an easy and superficial charm that captivated but that concealed a lack of sense substance beneath. Those who observed Edward closely came to recognize this shallowness, the superficiality that lay beneath the glamour and the charm, the lack of real depth or substance in the dazzling prince. The shallowness was a genuine feature of Edward's character, the superficiality that those who knew him came to recognize, the lack of real depth beneath the captivating surface of the glamorous prince, the lack of the qualities that his future position would demand, the absence of the discretion and the wisdom and the seriousness that a king would need. was a particular concern to those who recognized Edward's shallowness. The role of king demanded certain qualities, discretion and wisdom, and seriousness, and a capacity for sustained application to duty, and Edward, by temperament, possessed none of these. He was not discreet, not wise, not serious, not given to the sustained application that his future role would require. He was, instead, restless and pleasure-seeking and superficial, lacking the gravity and the discretion and the wisdom that the role of king demanded. Those who recognized Edward's shallowness recognized also this lack of the qualities his future position would require, the absence of the discretion and the wisdom and the seriousness that a king would need, the concern that the dazzling prince lacked the substance that his future role demanded. This lack of the necessary qualities, the absence of the discretion and the wisdom and the seriousness, was a particular concern, the recognition that Edward, for all his glamour and charm, lacked the substance that the role of king would require. The self-indulgence of Edward's life as Prince of Wales, the pursuit of pleasure and excitement that occupied so much of his time, was another mark of the shallowness beneath the glamour. Edward lived a life of pleasure and indulgence, occupying himself with the pursuit of excitement and amusement, devoting his time to the social whirl and the entertainments that befitted a glamorous prince. He enjoyed the nightlife, the parties, the social engagements of the fashionable world, devoting himself to pleasure and indulgence rather than to the serious preparation for his future role. The self-indulgence of his life, the pursuit of pleasure and excitement, reflected the shallowness of his character, the restless and pleasure-seeking temperament that drew him to amusement rather than to duty. And it reflected, too, a certain irresponsibility, a failure to take seriously the preparation for the role he would one day assume. The dazzling prince devoting himself to pleasure rather than to the serious development that his future position would require. The self-indulgence of Edward's life as Prince of Wales was thus another mark of the shallowness beneath the glamour, the pursuit of pleasure and excitement reflecting the restless and superficial character of the man. The comparison that observers have drawn between Edward and the celebrity idols of later ages captures something of the nature of his fame and the shallowness that accompanied it. Edward has been compared to the celebrity idols of later decades, the figures of mass adoration whose fame rested on glamour and image rather than substance. Like such later idols, Edward was the object of an adoration that rested on his glamour and his image, the dazzling surface that captivated the public, surrounded by an entourage and followed by an adoring public in a manner that anticipated the celebrity culture of later ages. This comparison captures something of the nature of Edward's fame, the adoration that rested on glamour and image rather than substance, the celebrity that anticipated the mass idols of later decades. And it captures, too, the shallowness that accompanied this kind of fame, the adoration of a glamorous image that concealed the lack of real substance beneath, the celebrity of a dazzling surface that masked the emptiness within. The comparison to the celebrity idols of later ages thus illuminates both the nature of Edward's fame and the shallowness that accompanied it, the adoration of a glamorous image masking the lack of substance beneath. The gap between Edward's dazzling public image and the flawed man beneath it is, then, one of the central truths of his story, the glamour that made him so popular concealing the shallowness and the unsuitedness that would destroy his reign. The public saw the dazzling Prince of Wales, the glamorous and charming and stylish young man who captivated the world, the celebrity idol whose every move was followed with adoration. But beneath this dazzling image lay a flawed man, a shallow and superficial figure who lacked the substance and the discretion and the wisdom that his future role would demand, an emotionally needy and pleasure-seeking man whose glamour concealed his unsuitedness for the throne. The gap between the public image and the private reality, between the dazzling prince and the flawed man beneath, is one of the central truths of Edward's story, the glamour that made him so popular concealing the shallowness and the unsuitedness that would, in time, destroy his reign and lead him to abandon his throne. The flaws beneath the glamour would become increasingly apparent as Edward's conduct gave cause for concern, the shallowness and the irresponsibility of the prince emerging in behavior that worried those who watched him. For as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, Edward's conduct began to give cause for concern, the pleasure-seeking and the self-indulgence of the prince taking forms that worried his father and the political establishment. His series of affairs with married women, his reckless and irresponsible behavior, his disregard for the conventions and the duties of his position, all began to give cause for concern, the flaws beneath the glamour emerging in conduct that worried those who watched him. How Edward's conduct gave cause for concern, how his affairs and his irresponsibility worried his father and the establishment, and how the flaws beneath the glamour became increasingly apparent, is where the story turns next. Those flaws and that concern, the trouble beneath the glamour, is where we go now. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the flaws that lay beneath Edward's glamorous surface became increasingly apparent, his conduct giving cause for concern to those who watched him, and confirming the doubts about his fitness for the throne. The pleasure-seeking and the irresponsibility and the shallowness that the glamour had concealed emerged in behavior that worried his father and the political establishment, the trouble beneath the glamour becoming ever harder to ignore. These flaws, and the concern they aroused, are essential to understanding the abdication, because they reveal the man whose unsuitedness for the throne was apparent long before the crisis that would force him from it. The most conspicuous of the flaws that worried those who watched Edward was his pattern of affairs with married women, the series of relationships that gave cause for concern throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Edward conducted, over these years, a series of affairs with married women, relationships that became a recurring feature of his private life. He became involved with a number of married women over the years, the affairs forming a pattern that worried his father and the establishment. One of the most significant of these relationships was with a woman of Anglo-American background who was his companion for a number of years, a married woman with whom he conducted a long relationship. Another was with the woman who would, in time, introduce him to Wallis Simpson, a married American woman who was his mistress before Wallis displaced her. These affairs with married women formed a pattern in Edward's private life, the series of relationships giving cause for concern, the prince conducting his romantic life through a succession of involvements with married women that worried those who watched him. The pattern of affairs with married women was particularly troubling because of the position that Edward occupied and the expectations that his position imposed. As the heir to the throne, Edward was expected to conduct himself with a certain propriety, to avoid the scandal and the impropriety that affairs with married women would invite. His position as the future king, the head of a monarchy that embodied a certain moral and social respectability, made his affairs with married women particularly troubling, the impropriety of his romantic life clashing with the respectability that his position demanded. The pattern was a source of genuine concern, the heir to the throne conducting a series of affairs that invited scandal and impropriety, his romantic life clashing with the expectations that his position imposed. The affairs with married women were thus particularly troubling because of Edward's position, the impropriety of his romantic life clashing with the respectability that the heir to the throne was expected to maintain. The reaction of Edward's father, King George V, to his son's affairs and conduct was one of deep disapproval and growing alarm, the king disgusted by the impropriety of the affairs and disappointed by his son's failure to settle down. George V, the man of rigid discipline and conventional values, was deeply disturbed by his son's conduct, disgusted by the affairs with married women, disappointed by Edward's failure to marry and settle into a respectable life. The king disapproved strongly of his son's romantic life, regarding the affairs with married women as a disgrace, an impropriety that clashed with the values he held and the respectability he expected of the heir to the throne. And he was disappointed by Edward's failure to settle down, to marry suitably, and to establish the respectable family life that his position demanded. The king's hopes for his son frustrated by Edward's continued pursuit of unsuitable affairs. The reaction of George V to his son's conduct was thus one of deep disapproval and growing disappointment, the king disgusted by the affairs and frustrated by Edward's failure to settle into the respectable life that his position required. The concern that Edward's conduct aroused extended beyond his father to the political establishment, the prince's reckless behavior worrying the prime minister and those responsible for the affairs of state. Edward's conduct gave cause for concern not only to his father, but to the political establishment, the prime minister, and the senior figures of the government, worried by the prince's recklessness and impropriety. The reckless behavior of the heir to the throne, his affairs and his self-indulgence, and his disregard for the conventions of his position, worried those responsible for the affairs of state. The concern about the future king's conduct extending into the highest circles of the government. The prime minister was worried by Edward's behavior, the recklessness and the impropriety of the prince, giving cause for concern to those who recognized that this man would one day be king. The concern thus extended beyond Edward's father to the political establishment, the prince's conduct worrying the prime minister and the senior figures of the government. The recklessness of the future king, a source of anxiety to those responsible for the affairs of state. The self-indulgence that Edward pursued at his country retreat, the private life of pleasure and informality that he indulged at Fort Belvedere, was another aspect of the conduct that gave cause for concern. In 1930, King George V gave Edward a country house, a retreat, where the prince could pursue his private life away from the formality of the court. Edward took to this retreat with enthusiasm, making it the center of his private life, the place where he could indulge his pleasures and his informality away from the constraints of his official role. At his country retreat, Edward pursued a life of pleasure and informality, entertaining his friends, indulging his romantic affairs, devoting himself to the amusements and the self-indulgence that the place afforded. This private life of pleasure and informality, the self-indulgence that Edward pursued at his retreat, was another aspect of the conduct that gave cause for concern, the prince devoting himself to pleasure and amusement rather than to the serious preparation for his future role. The country retreat became the setting for Edward's self-indulgence, the place where he pursued the life of pleasure and informality that reflected the irresponsibility and the shallowness of his character. A darker aspect of Edward's character, one that his biographers would later document and that taxes his reputation severely, was his propensity for prejudiced and racist remarks about the peoples of the empire and the wider world. Edward made, over the course of his life as Prince of Wales and later as Duke of Windsor, a number of prejudiced and racist remarks about the peoples he encountered on his travels, comments that revealed an ugly streak of prejudice beneath the charming surface. He spoke of the subjects of the empire and the peoples of the various countries he visited in terms that were demeaning and prejudiced, his remarks revealing a contempt and a prejudice that his biographers would later document and condemn. These remarks were little commented upon at the time, the prejudices of the age allowing them to pass without much notice, but later biographers, examining Edward's record, would document these comments and use them to tax his reputation severely. The propensity for prejudiced and racist remarks was a genuine and a troubling aspect of Edward's character, the ugly streak of prejudice beneath the charming surface, the comments that revealed a contempt for the peoples of the empire and the world that his biographers would later document and condemn. The recognition of this darker aspect of Edward's character complicates the image of the charming and sympathetic prince, revealing a less attractive figure beneath the glamorous surface. The Edward who showed a genuine if superficial sympathy for the disadvantaged of Britain was also the Edward who made demeaning and prejudiced remarks about the peoples of the empire and the world, the charming prince concealing an ugly streak of prejudice and contempt. This contradiction, the sympathy for some and the contempt for others, complicates the image of the charming and sympathetic prince, revealing a less attractive figure beneath the glamorous surface, a man whose charm concealed prejudices and contempt that his biographers would later document. The recognition of this darker aspect thus complicates the image of Edward, the charming and sympathetic prince, revealed as a more troubling figure, his glamour and his charm concealing an ugly streak of prejudice that taxes his reputation and complicates any simple admiration for the dazzling Prince of Wales. The accumulation of concerns about Edward's conduct, the affairs and the recklessness and the self-indulgence and the prejudices, led King George V to a foreboding about his son's fitness for the throne, a fear that Edward would bring disaster upon himself and the monarchy. As the concerns about Edward's conduct accumulated, George V came to a dark foreboding about his son's future, a fear that Edward was unfit for the throne and would bring disaster upon himself. The king, observing his son's recklessness and impropriety, and irresponsibility, came to doubt Edward's fitness for the throne, to fear that the heir would ruin himself and damage the monarchy. There is a remark attributed to George V that captures this foreboding, an expression of his fear that his son would bring disaster upon himself within a short time of inheriting the throne, the king's dark prophecy about the heir whose unfitness he had come to recognize. The foreboding of George V, the fear that Edward would ruin himself and damage the monarchy, reflected the king's recognition of his son's unsuitedness, the accumulation of concerns about Edward's conduct leading the king to a dark prophecy about the heir's fitness for the throne. The king's foreboding extended to a preference for his second son over his heir, George V, coming to favor the steadier and more dutiful Albert over the glamorous but unsuitable Edward. George V, doubting Edward's fitness for the throne, came to favor his second son, Albert, the steadier and more dutiful brother who lacked Edward's glamour but who possessed the seriousness and the sense of duty that the king valued. Albert, the future King George VI, was a shyer and less glamorous figure than Edward, but he was steadier and more dutiful, more suited by temperament to the responsibilities of the throne, and George V came to favor him over his glamorous but unsuitable heir. The king's preference for Albert, his favoring of the dutiful second son over the unsuitable heir, reflected his foreboding about Edward, his recognition that the steadier Albert was better suited to the throne than the glamorous but irresponsible Edward. This preference, the king's favoring of Albert over Edward, anticipated the eventual outcome, the dutiful second son, who would, after the abdication, take the throne that the unsuitable heir would abandon, the king's foreboding, and his preference for Albert, anticipating the succession that the abdication would bring about. The foreboding of George V, then, captured the recognition that Edward was unsuited to the throne, a recognition that anticipated the abdication that was to come. The king's fear that Edward would ruin himself, his doubt about his son's fitness for the throne, his preference for the dutiful Albert, all reflected the recognition that Edward was unsuited to the role he would inherit, the flaws beneath the glamour, rendering him unfit for the throne. And this recognition, the foreboding of the king about his son's unsuitedness, anticipated the abdication that was to come, the unsuitable heir who would, in the end, fulfill his father's foreboding by abandoning the throne. The foreboding of George V thus captured the truth about Edward, the recognition that the glamorous but flawed heir was unsuited to the throne, the king's dark prophecy anticipating the abdication that would, in the end, fulfill the unsuitedness that his father had recognized. The flaws beneath the glamour, then, the affairs and the recklessness and the self-indulgence and the prejudices revealed the unsuitedness that the king had come to recognize, the trouble beneath the glamorous surface confirming the doubts about Edward's fitness for the throne, the pattern of affairs with married women, the reckless behavior that worried the king and the establishment, the self-indulgence at the country retreat, the prejudices that his biographers would later document, all revealed the flaws beneath the glamour, the unsuitedness that lay beneath the dazzling surface of the Prince of Wales. And these flaws, confirming the doubts about Edward's fitness for the throne, anticipated the abdication that was to come, the unsuitable heir, whose flaws the king had recognized fulfilling, in the end, the foreboding that his conduct had aroused. The flaws beneath the glamour thus revealed the unsuitedness that the king had come to recognize, the trouble beneath the glamorous surface confirming the doubts about Edward's fitness for the throne, and anticipating the abdication that would, in the end, fulfill his unsuitedness. It was into this life, the life of the glamorous but flawed and unsuitable Prince of Wales, that Wallis Simpson entered, the married American woman who would become the great obsession of Edward's life and the occasion of his abdication. For the flaws and the neediness and the unsuitedness that marked Edward would find their fullest expression in his obsession with Wallis, the emotionally needy prince, becoming utterly dependent on the strong and dominating woman who entered his life. How Wallis entered Edward's life, how the emotionally needy prince became so utterly dependent on her, and what his obsession with her revealed about the flaws and the neediness that marked his character, is where the story turns next. That obsession, and what it revealed about Edward, is where we go now. It was into the life of this glamorous, but flawed and emotionally needy prince that Wallis Simpson entered, and the obsession that developed between them would become the great force of Edward's life and the occasion of his abdication. The obsession is best understood not through the character of Wallis, which has been examined endlessly, but through the psychology of Edward, the emotionally needy and dependent man who found in Wallis the strong and dominating presence that his nature craved. To understand the abdication, you have to understand why this man became so utterly dependent on this woman, and the answer lies in the neediness and the emptiness that his formation had bred. Edward met Wallis Simpson in January 1931, the introduction coming through the woman who was then his mistress, the American Lady Furness, who moved in his social circle. Wallis, then the wife of a London businessman, was part of the fashionable society that surrounded the Prince of Wales, and through Lady Furness, she was introduced to Edward, brought into his orbit, the meeting that would, in time, change the course of his life. The introduction was, at first, unremarkable, simply the meeting of the prince with another woman of his social circle, with no hint of the obsession that would eventually develop. Edward met Wallis as one of many figures in his social world, the American wife of a London businessman who was part of the fashionable society that surrounded him, the meeting that would, in the fullness of time, become the great turning point of his life, but that began as an ordinary social encounter. Over the following years, Edward's acquaintance with Wallis deepened, and by 1934 he had fallen completely under her spell, displacing Lady Furness and making Wallis the center of his life. The acquaintance that had begun in 1931 deepened over the following years, Edward drawn increasingly to Wallis, until by 1934 he had fallen completely in love with her, utterly captivated by the American woman who had entered his life. Wallis displaced Lady Furness, the mistress who had introduced her, becoming herself the object of Edward's devotion, the center of his life, the woman who had captured the prince completely. By 1934, Edward was, in the words of his official biographer, slavishly dependent on Wallis, utterly enthralled to her, completely captivated by the woman who had become the center of his existence. The acquaintance had deepened into obsession, Edward falling completely under Wallis's spell, displacing the mistress who had introduced her, and making Wallis the great obsession of his life. The nature of Edward's attachment to Wallis was one of complete dependence and submission, the prince utterly enthralled to the strong and dominating woman who had captured him. Edward's attachment to Wallis was not the attachment of an equal, but the dependence of a man utterly enthralled, his devotion taking the form of a complete submission to the woman who dominated him. He became slavishly dependent on Wallis, organizing his life around her, deferring to her in all things, unable to do without her, his devotion taking the form of a complete and abject dependence. Wallis dominated Edward, took charge of him, exercised a kind of control over the prince that observers found striking, and Edward, far from resenting this domination, craved it, submitting to Wallis's control with an eagerness that revealed the depth of his need. The nature of Edward's attachment was thus one of complete dependence and submission, the prince utterly enthralled to the strong and dominating woman who had captured him, his devotion taking the form of an abject dependence on the woman who dominated him. The dynamic of dominance and submission that characterized the relationship, with Wallis dominating and Edward submitting, was noted by many who observed the couple. Observers of Edward and Wallis noted the striking dynamic between them, the strong and dominating Wallis and the submissive and dependent Edward, the woman taking charge and the prince deferring to her. There is a report from those who observed the couple, an account of a witness who noted that Wallis seemed to have the prince completely under her control, the observation capturing the dynamic of dominance and submission that characterized the relationship. Wallis dominated Edward, controlled him, took charge of him, and Edward submitted, deferred, depended, the dynamic of dominance and submission striking to those who observed the couple. This dynamic, with Wallis dominating and Edward submitting, was a defining feature of the relationship, the strong and dominating woman and the submissive and dependent prince, the dynamic that observers noted and that revealed the nature of Edward's attachment to the woman who controlled him. The psychological roots of Edward's dependence, the reasons why this man became so utterly enthralled to a dominating woman, lie in the emotional neediness that his formation had bred. The emotionally needy man who emerged from Edward's cold and demanding upbringing, hungry for the warmth and the reassurance and the strong guiding presence that his childhood had denied him, found in Wallis exactly what his nature craved. Edward's cold upbringing, the emotional deprivation of his childhood, had bred in him a deep neediness, a hunger for warmth and reassurance, and a strong guiding presence, the emotional needs that his formation had failed to satisfy. And in Wallis, the strong and dominating woman who took charge of him and controlled him, Edward found the satisfaction of these needs, the strong guiding presence that his nature craved, the warmth and the reassurance and the control that answered his emotional neediness. The psychological roots of Edward's dependence thus lie in the emotional neediness that his formation had bred, the hunger for a strong guiding presence that his cold upbringing had created, finding its satisfaction in the dominating Wallis, who took charge of him and controlled him. The strength and the dominance that Wallis offered answered a need in Edward that ran deep, the need of an emotionally weak and dependent man for a strong figure to take charge of him and give him direction. Edward was, beneath his glamorous surface, an emotionally weak and dependent man, lacking the inner strength and the self-sufficiency that his position demanded, hungry for a strong figure to take charge of him and give him direction. And Wallis, with her strength and her dominance, answered this need, becoming the strong figure who took charge of the weak and dependent prince, giving him the direction and the control that his nature craved. The strength that Wallis offered, the dominance that she exercised, answered the deep need of an emotionally weak and dependent man for a strong guiding presence, the need that ran through Edward's character and that Wallis satisfied. This need, the need of an emotionally weak and dependent man for a strong figure to take charge of him, was at the heart of Edward's dependence on Wallis, the strength and the dominance that she offered, answering the deep need that his emotional weakness had created. The completeness of Edward's obsession, the totality of his dependence on Wallis, meant that the relationship came to override everything else in his life, including his duty and his judgment and his fitness for the throne. Edward's obsession with Wallis was complete, his dependence on her total, and the relationship came to dominate his life entirely, overriding every other consideration. His devotion to Wallis overrode his duty, his judgment, his discretion, his concern for his position and the monarchy, the obsession consuming everything else in his life. He could not do without Wallis, would not be parted from her, organized his entire existence around her, the obsession overriding all other considerations and consuming his life completely. This completeness of the obsession, the totality of the dependence, meant that the relationship came to override everything else. Edward's devotion to Wallis consuming his duty and his judgment and his concern for his position, the obsession dominating his life so completely that nothing else could compete with it. The significance of this complete obsession for the abdication is profound, because it was the totality of Edward's dependence on Wallis that would, in the end, lead him to choose her over the throne. The abdication would come about because Edward's obsession with Wallis was so complete that he could not contemplate life without her, because his dependence on her was so total that he would give up the throne rather than give her up. The completeness of the obsession, the totality of the dependence, was thus the force that would drive the abdication, Edward's inability to do without Wallis leading him, in the end, to choose her over the crown. The significance of the obsession for the abdication is profound, the totality of Edward's dependence on Wallis being the force that would lead him to abandon the throne, the obsession so complete that he would give up the crown rather than give up the woman on whom he had become so utterly dependent. The psychology of Edward's obsession, then, the emotional neediness that drove his dependence on Wallis, is essential to understanding the abdication because it reveals the man whose unsuitedness and weakness would lead him to abandon the throne. The emotionally needy man who emerged from Edward's cold upbringing, hungry for a strong guiding presence, found in Wallis the satisfaction of his needs, becoming so utterly dependent on her that he would give up the throne rather than give her up. The obsession reveals the weakness and the neediness at the heart of Edward's character, the emotional dependence that drove his attachment to Wallis, the man whose unsuitedness and weakness would lead him to abandon the throne. And this understanding, the psychology of Edward's obsession, is essential to understanding the abdication, the emotional neediness that drove his dependence on Wallis, revealing the man whose weakness and unsuitedness would, in the end, lead him to choose the woman over the crown. This obsession, complete and consuming, would collide with the responsibilities of the throne when Edward, in January 1936, became king. The emotionally dependent man, who could not do without his married mistress, suddenly bearing the responsibilities of the sovereign. For the obsession that had consumed Edward as Prince of Wales would not diminish when he became king, but would, instead, collide with the responsibilities of the throne, the man utterly dependent on a married American, suddenly bearing the duties of the monarch. How Edward's accession to the throne brought his obsession into collision with the responsibilities of the sovereign, how the emotionally dependent man fared as king, and how his neglect of his duties and his obsession with Wallis combined to create a crisis, is where the story turns next. That accession and the collision of obsession and duty is where we go now. When George V died in January 1936 and Edward became king, the obsession that had consumed him as Prince of Wales collided with the responsibilities of the throne, and the collision revealed, with alarming speed, how unfit Edward was for the role he had inherited. The brief reign of Edward VIII, lasting less than 11 months, was marked by a neglect of duty and a disregard for the responsibilities of the sovereign that confirmed his father's foreboding and that created, in its mishandling of the secret papers of state, a genuine danger to the security of the nation. George V died on the 20th of January 1936, and Edward, at last, became king, ascending the throne that he had been destined to inherit and that his father had feared he would ruin. The death of the old king, the man of rigid discipline and conventional values, who had ruled for a quarter of a century, brought Edward to the throne, the glamorous but flawed and emotionally dependent prince, becoming King Edward VIII. The accession was the moment toward which Edward's entire life had pointed, the assumption of the throne that he had been raised to inherit, and it was also the moment that his father had feared, the elevation of the unsuitable heir to the role that George V had doubted his fitness to fill. Edward became king, and the foreboding of his father, the fear that the unsuitable heir would ruin himself, would begin almost immediately to be confirmed. From the very beginning of his reign, Edward showed a disregard for the conventions and the expectations of his position, breaking with custom in ways that signaled his unfitness for the throne. On the very day after his accession, Edward broke with custom in a striking manner, watching the proclamation of his own accession from a window in the company of Wallis Simpson, the married woman who was his mistress. The breach was significant, the new king flaunting his relationship with his married mistress at the very moment of his accession, watching the proclamation of his own kingship, with Wallis at his side, in a public display that signaled his disregard for the conventions of his position. This breach of custom, the flaunting of his relationship with his married mistress at the moment of his accession, was an early sign of the disregard for convention that would mark Edward's reign, the new king signaling from the very beginning his unwillingness to subordinate his obsession to the expectations of his position. The economies that Edward instituted in the royal household, the cost-cutting measures that he imposed upon the royal estates, made him unpopular with the staff and reflected a certain harshness in his character. As king, Edward set in motion drastic economies in the royal estates, cost-cutting measures intended to reduce the expenses of the royal household. These economies, the reductions in spending and the cuts to the royal establishment, made Edward unpopular with the staff of the royal household, the servants and the retainers who suffered from the cost-cutting measures he imposed. The economies reflected a certain harshness in Edward's character, a willingness to impose hardship on the staff who depended on the royal household, a meanness that contrasted with the lavishness he showed in other aspects of his life. The cost-cutting measures, the drastic economies imposed upon the royal estates, thus made Edward unpopular with the staff and reflected a certain harshness in his character, the new king imposing hardship on the household that depended on him. The most striking display of Edward's disregard for discretion came during a summer cruise in 1936, when the king flaunted his relationship with the still-married Wallis before the eyes of the world. In the summer of 1936, Edward took a cruise in the Mediterranean, traveling on a private yacht in the company of Wallis and a party of friends. During this cruise, Edward flaunted his relationship with Wallis openly, displaying his devotion to the married American before the eyes of the world. The cruise attracting the attention of the foreign press and providing a spectacle of the king's infatuation. Wallis, by some accounts, pleaded with Edward to be more discreet, to avoid the open display of their relationship that was attracting such attention. But Edward, it is reported, laughed her concerns aside, declaring that discretion was a quality he had never particularly admired. This display, the flaunting of his relationship with the still married Wallis during the summer cruise, was a striking demonstration of Edward's disregard for discretion. The king displaying his infatuation before the eyes of the world, and dismissing the discretion that his position demanded. The attitude toward discretion that Edward displayed during the cruise, the open dismissal of the discretion that his position required, reflected a fundamental unfitness for the role of constitutional monarch. The role of king demanded discretion above all, the careful and prudent conduct that would protect the dignity and the standing of the monarchy. And Edward, by dismissing discretion as a quality he had never particularly admired, by flaunting his relationship with his married mistress before the eyes of the world, displayed a fundamental unfitness for the role, a disregard for the discretion that his position required. The attitude toward discretion that Edward displayed, the open dismissal of the prudent conduct that his position demanded, reflected the unfitness for the throne that his father had recognized, the king's disregard for discretion, confirming the doubts about his fitness for the role of constitutional monarch. The neglect of his official duties, the failure to attend to the serious business of the sovereign, was another mark of Edward's unfitness for the throne. As king, Edward neglected the official duties that his position required, failing to attend properly to the serious business of the sovereign. The role of king involved a great deal of serious and unglamorous work, the attention to the papers of state, the reading of the official documents, the careful attention to the business of government that the sovereign was required to perform. And Edward neglected this work, bored by the serious business of the sovereign, inattentive to the papers of state, failing to perform the careful and diligent work that his position required. The neglect of his official duties, the failure to attend to the serious business of the sovereign, was a mark of Edward's unfitness for the throne, the king's boredom with the serious work of his position, reflecting the shallowness and the irresponsibility that had marked his character as Prince of Wales. The most serious aspect of Edward's neglect, and the one that created a genuine danger to the nation, was his mishandling of the secret papers of state, the confidential documents that he treated with a carelessness that alarmed the senior figures of the government. The sovereign received, in the boxes of state papers, the most confidential documents of the government, the secret reports, and the diplomatic communications, and the details of national security that were entrusted to the king. And Edward treated these confidential documents with a carelessness that created a genuine danger, leaving the secret papers lying about where they could be seen by others, failing to protect the confidential information that was entrusted to him. The mishandling of the secret papers of state, the carelessness with which Edward treated the confidential documents of the government, created a genuine danger to the nation, the king's negligence threatening the security of the confidential information that his position required him to protect. The alarm that Edward's mishandling of the state papers caused among the senior figures of the government reflected the seriousness of the danger, the most senior officials meeting to discuss the disquiet about the king's handling of the confidential documents. Within a short time of Edward's accession, the most senior officials of the government, the heads of the civil service and the security and the foreign service, met to discuss their disquiet about the king's handling of the secret papers of state. They were alarmed by Edward's carelessness with the confidential documents, by the secret papers left lying about at his country retreat where any visitor might see them, by the danger that the king's negligence posed to the security of the nation. The alarm of these senior officials, the disquiet that led them to meet and discuss the king's handling of the state papers, reflected the seriousness of the danger that Edward's carelessness had created. The most senior figures of the government, recognizing the threat that the king's negligence posed to the security of the confidential information that his position required him to protect. A particular concern was that Edward shared the confidential documents with Wallis, discussing the secret papers of state with the married American who held such sway over him. Edward, it was reported, shared the confidential documents with Wallis, showing her the secret papers of state, discussing their contents with the woman who dominated him. This sharing of the confidential documents with Wallis was a particular concern, the king exposing the secrets of state to a woman who held no official position and whose own loyalties and connections were a source of anxiety. And the concern was compounded by the company that Edward and Wallis kept, the foreign diplomats who socialized with them and who might learn the secrets that Edward so carelessly exposed. The sharing of the confidential documents with Wallis, the exposure of the secrets of state to the married American who dominated the king, was a particular concern. The danger of Edward's negligence, compounded by his sharing of the confidential documents with a woman whose loyalties were a source of anxiety and whose social circle included foreign diplomats. The danger that Edward's mishandling of the state papers posed was so serious that the foreign embassies in London were reporting to their governments on Wallis's influence over the king, the intelligence services intercepting communications that revealed the extent of the concern. The influence that Wallis held over Edward and the danger that his negligence posed were matters of such concern that the foreign embassies in London were reporting to their governments on the situation, the diplomats observing and reporting on Wallis's sway over the king. The intelligence services, intercepting these communications, learned of the foreign embassy's reports on Wallis's influence, the interception revealing the extent to which the situation had become a matter of international concern. This reporting by the foreign embassies, the international attention to Wallis's influence over the king and the danger of his negligence, reflected the seriousness of the situation that Edward's mishandling of the state papers had created, the king's negligence and his exposure of the secrets of state to Wallis becoming a matter of international concern that the intelligence services observed with alarm. The brief reign of Edward VIII then confirmed his father's foreboding and revealed his unfitness for the throne, the neglect of duty and the disregard for discretion and the mishandling of the secret papers of state, demonstrating that the unsuitable heir was indeed unfit to be king. The disregard for convention from the very beginning of his reign, the harshness of his economies, the flaunting of his relationship with his married mistress, the dismissal of discretion, the neglect of his official duties, the mishandling of the secret papers of state, all confirmed the foreboding of George V, the recognition that Edward was unfit for the throne, and the mishandling of the state papers, the genuine danger that Edward's negligence created, demonstrated the seriousness of his unfitness, the king's carelessness with the secrets of state threatening the security of the nation. The brief reign of Edward VIII thus confirmed his father's foreboding and revealed his unfitness for the throne, the neglect of duty and the disregard for discretion, and the mishandling of the secret papers, demonstrating that the unsuitable heir was indeed unfit to be king. There is a deeper truth revealed by Edward's conduct as king, a truth that bears on the whole understanding of the abdication, which is that Edward did not, in fact, want the burden of the throne, that the neglect and the disregard reflected not mere carelessness, but a fundamental unwillingness to do the job. For the neglect of duty and the disregard for the responsibilities of the sovereign reflected, at the deepest level, Edward's unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, his lack of desire for the role that he had inherited. How Edward's conduct as king revealed his fundamental unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, how the evidence shows that he did not want the role he had inherited, and what this reveals about the abdication that was to come, is where the story turns next. That unwillingness, the king who did not want to be king, is where we go now. Beneath the neglect of duty and the disregard for the responsibilities of the sovereign lay a deeper truth, one that transforms the whole understanding of the abdication, which is that Edward did not want to be king. The evidence, examined honestly, suggests that Edward never enjoyed the role he had inherited, that he found the burden of the throne intolerable, that he confessed his unwillingness to those close to him, and that the abdication was, in significant part, an escape from a job he could not bear, rather than the tragic sacrifice that the romantic legend supposes. The evidence that Edward never enjoyed being king, that he found the role tedious and burdensome, is considerable and comes from various sources. Edward, by the testimony of those who observed him and the judgment of the historians who have studied him, did not enjoy the role of king, finding the duties tedious and the burden intolerable. He soon grew bored with the official duties that his position required, the serious and unglamorous work of the sovereign, holding no appeal for the restless and pleasure-seeking man. He found the reading of the state papers tedious, the attention to the business of government burdensome, the ceremonial and the routine of the royal role wearisome. The evidence suggests that Edward, far from relishing the throne he had inherited, found the role tedious and burdensome, the duties of the sovereign holding no appeal for a man whose temperament was ill-suited to the serious work that his position required. This evidence, that Edward never enjoyed being king and found the role tedious and burdensome, is considerable, the testimony of observers and the judgment of historians confirming that Edward did not relish the throne he had inherited. The boredom that Edward felt with the duties of the sovereign, the tedium of the state papers, and the routine of the royal role reflected the fundamental mismatch between his temperament and the demands of the throne. The role of king demanded a capacity for sustained attention to serious and unglamorous work, a willingness to apply oneself diligently to the business of government, a temperament suited to the duty and the routine that the position required. And Edward, the restless and pleasure-seeking man, lacked this temperament entirely, finding the serious work of the sovereign tedious and the routine of the royal role wearisome. The boredom that Edward felt with the duties of the sovereign reflected this fundamental mismatch, the gap between his pleasure-seeking temperament and the diligent application that the throne required, the restless prince ill-suited to the serious and unglamorous work that the role of king demanded. This mismatch, the gap between Edward's temperament and the demands of the throne, was at the heart of his unwillingness to be king, the boredom and the tedium reflecting the fundamental unsuitedness of his temperament to the role he had inherited. The most striking evidence of Edward's unwillingness to be king comes from his own confessions to those close to him, his admissions that he could not bear the role he had inherited. Edward, by some accounts, confessed his unwillingness to be king to those close to him, admitting that he found the role intolerable, that he could not bear the burden of the throne. There is a report that Edward confided to his youngest brother that he could not endure being king, the admission revealing the depth of his unwillingness to bear the role he had inherited. These confessions, the admissions to those close to him that he could not bear the burden of the throne, are the most striking evidence of Edward's unwillingness to be king, the king himself acknowledging that he found the role intolerable, that he could not endure the burden that his position imposed. The confessions reveal the truth that lay beneath the neglect and the disregard, the fundamental unwillingness of Edward to bear the role he had inherited, the king acknowledging to those close to him that he could not endure the burden of the throne. The contrast between Edward's unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne and the dutiful devotion of his father, who had borne the burden impeccably for a quarter of a century, throws Edward's unfitness into sharp relief. George V had borne the burden of the throne with a dutiful devotion, applying himself diligently to the serious work of the sovereign, attending faithfully to the business of government, performing the duties of his position with a conscientiousness that marked him as a model constitutional monarch. He had played his part impeccably through an era of war and revolution and political instability, bearing the burden of the throne with a steadiness and a sense of duty that Edward conspicuously lacked. The contrast between the dutiful father and the unwilling son throws Edward's unfitness into sharp relief, the conscientious devotion of George V highlighting the boredom and the unwillingness of Edward, the model constitutional monarch, contrasting with the restless and pleasure-seeking heir who could not bear the burden of the throne. This contrast between the dutiful father and the unwilling son reveals the depth of Edward's unfitness, the conscientious devotion of George V highlighting the fundamental unwillingness of Edward to bear the role that his father had performed so faithfully. The recognition that Edward did not want to be king transforms the understanding of the abdication, suggesting that it was, in significant part, an escape from a burden he could not bear, rather than the tragic sacrifice that the Romantic legend supposes. The Romantic legend treats the abdication as a tragic sacrifice, the heartbreaking renunciation of a throne that Edward loved for the sake of the woman he loved more. But the recognition that Edward did not want to be king transforms this understanding, suggesting that the abdication was, in significant part, an escape, the release from a burden that Edward could not bear, the way out of a role that he found intolerable. If Edward did not want the throne, if he found the burden of kingship intolerable, then the abdication was not the tragic sacrifice of a beloved role, but the escape from an unwanted burden, the release from a job that Edward could not endure. This recognition transforms the understanding of the abdication, the renunciation of the throne, appearing not as a tragic sacrifice, but as an escape from an unwanted burden, the way out of a role that Edward found intolerable. The way that Wallis functioned, in this understanding, as both the reason and the means of Edward's escape, is one of the deeper truths of the abdication. Wallis provided Edward with both a reason to abandon the throne and a means of escaping it. The obsession with her giving him both the motive and the mechanism for the release from a burden he could not bear. The desire to marry Wallis gave Edward a reason to abandon the throne, a motive for the renunciation that he might otherwise have lacked the resolve to undertake. And the impossibility of marrying Wallis while remaining king gave Edward a mechanism for the escape, the conflict between his obsession and his position providing the means by which he could be released from the burden of the throne. In this understanding, Wallis functioned as both the reason and the means of Edward's escape, the obsession with her giving him both the motive to abandon the throne and the mechanism for the release from a burden he could not bear. This is one of the deeper truths of the abdication, the way that Wallis provided Edward with both the reason and the means of his escape from a role he did not want. The honest understanding of the abdication, then, is that it was as much an escape as a sacrifice, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear, rather than the tragic renunciation of a beloved throne. The abdication was not, in the honest understanding, the heartbreaking sacrifice that the romantic legend supposes, the renunciation of a throne that Edward loved for the sake of the woman he loved more. It was, instead, as much an escape as a sacrifice, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear, the way out of a role that Edward found intolerable, provided by the obsession with Wallis that gave him both the reason and the means of his escape. This honest understanding of the abdication, the recognition that it was as much an escape as a sacrifice, transforms the romantic legend, the renunciation of the throne appearing not as a tragic sacrifice, but as the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear.
If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one.
There is a complexity here that the honest understanding must acknowledge, which is that the abdication was not simply an escape, but a mixture of motives, the desire for Wallis, and the unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, combining to produce the renunciation. The abdication cannot be reduced simply to an escape, as if Edward cynically used Wallis as a pretext for abandoning a throne he did not want. The reality was more complex, a mixture of motives, the genuine obsession with Wallis, and the genuine unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, combining to produce the abdication. Edward genuinely loved Wallis, genuinely could not contemplate life without her, and this obsession was a real and powerful motive for the abdication. And Edward also genuinely did not want the burden of the throne, genuinely found the role intolerable, and this unwillingness was also a real motive for the renunciation. The abdication was thus a mixture of these motives, the obsession with Wallis and the unwillingness to bear the burden combining to produce the renunciation, the complexity that the honest understanding must acknowledge. The abdication was not simply an escape, but a mixture of the desire for Wallis and the unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, the two motives combining to produce the renunciation that would change the course of the monarchy. The deeper truth that emerges from this understanding, the truth that Edward was a man who did not want the role he had inherited and who found in Wallis both the reason and the means of his escape, is essential to the honest assessment of the abdication. The abdication was not the tragic sacrifice of a beloved throne, but the release of an unwilling king, the renunciation of a burden that Edward could not bear, provided by the obsession with Wallis that gave him both the motive and the mechanism for his escape. This deeper truth, the truth that Edward did not want to be king and found in Wallis both the reason and the means of his escape, transforms the romantic legend, revealing the abdication as the release of an unwilling king rather than the tragic sacrifice that the legend supposes. And this truth is essential to the honest assessment of the abdication, the recognition that Edward did not want the role he had inherited, revealing the renunciation as an escape as much as a sacrifice, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear. This understanding of the abdication as the release of an unwilling king, sets the stage for the crisis itself, the confrontation between Edward's determination to marry Wallis and the impossibility of that marriage that would force the renunciation. For the abdication, whatever its deeper motives, came about through a specific crisis, the confrontation between Edward's determination to marry Wallis and the constitutional impossibility of that marriage that would force the choice between the woman and the throne. How the crisis unfolded, how Edward's determination to marry Wallis collided with the constitutional impossibility of that marriage, and how the confrontation forced the choice that would end his reign, is where the story turns next. That crisis, and the choice it forced, is where we go now. The abdication, whatever its deeper roots in Edward's unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, came about through a specific crisis, the confrontation between his determination to marry Wallis and the constitutional impossibility of that marriage. The crisis unfolded over the autumn of 1936, building toward the choice that Edward would have to make between the woman he was determined to marry and the throne he had inherited, and it revealed, in Edward's fixed determination to have Wallis whatever the cost, the completeness of the obsession that drove him. The crisis arose from Wallis's divorce and Edward's determination to marry her, the steps toward the marriage, forcing the confrontation that would end his reign. In October 1936, Wallis obtained a preliminary decree in her divorce from her second husband, taking the step that would, in time, free her to marry again. And Edward, determined to marry Wallis once her divorce was final, made clear his intention to make her his wife, the determination that would force the crisis. The combination of Wallis's divorce and Edward's determination to marry her created the crisis, the steps toward the marriage forcing the confrontation between Edward's intention and the impossibility of a king marrying a twice-divorced American. The crisis thus arose from Wallis's divorce and Edward's determination to marry her, the steps toward the marriage forcing the confrontation that would, in the end, force Edward to choose between the woman and the throne. The impossibility of the marriage, the reasons why a king could not marry Wallis, lay in the constitutional and the religious obstacles that made such a union unthinkable. Wallis was a twice-divorced woman, with two former husbands living, and for the king to marry such a woman was, in the view of the establishment, impossible. The king was the head of the Church of England, and the Church did not sanction the remarriage of divorced people whose former spouses were living, so for the king to marry a twice-divorced woman would set the head of the Church in direct conflict with the Church's own teaching. Beyond the religious obstacle lay the whole weight of establishment opinion, the conviction that a twice-divorced American commoner was an impossible queen, that such a marriage would damage the dignity and the standing of the monarchy. The impossibility of the marriage thus lay in these constitutional and religious obstacles, the conflict with the Church's teaching, and the weight of establishment opinion, making the union of the king with a twice-divorced American unthinkable. The handling of the crisis was shaped, in its early stages, by the silence of the British press, which kept the story from the British public, even as the foreign press reported it freely. The British press maintained, through the autumn of 1936, a remarkable silence about Edward's relationship with Wallis, declining to report the story that was filling the newspapers of America and the continent. This silence, the gentlemanly agreement of the British press to keep the story from the public, meant that the British people remained largely unaware of the crisis that was building. The relationship between the king and Wallis kept from them, even as the foreign press reported it freely. The contrast between the silence of the British press and the freedom of the foreign press was striking. The British public kept in ignorance of a story that was being reported around the world. The silence of the British press thus shaped the early stages of the crisis. The British public kept unaware of the relationship between the king and Wallis, even as the foreign press reported it freely, the story breaking in Britain only in the early days of December 1936. The opposition to the marriage from the government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, was the decisive force that brought the crisis to a head, the government making clear that the marriage could not be permitted. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, took the position that the marriage could not be allowed, that the king could not marry Wallis and remain on the throne. Baldwin made clear to Edward that the marriage was impossible, that the establishment would not accept a twice-divorced American as queen, that if Edward insisted on marrying Wallis, he would have to give up the throne. The government's opposition, expressed by Baldwin, was the decisive force in the crisis, the Prime Minister making clear that the marriage could not be permitted, and that Edward would have to choose between Wallis and the throne. This opposition, the government's refusal to permit the marriage, brought the crisis to a head, Baldwin's insistence that Edward choose between the woman and the throne forcing the confrontation that would end his reign. The opposition to the marriage extended beyond the British government, to the governments of the dominions, whose consent was required, and who shared the opposition to the union. The dominions, the self-governing nations of the empire, were consulted on the crisis, their consent required for the constitutional changes that the situation involved, and the dominions shared the opposition to the marriage, their governments unwilling to accept a twice-divorced American as queen, their opposition adding to the weight against the union. The opposition of the dominions, the refusal of the empire's self-governing nations to accept the marriage, extended the opposition beyond the British government. The union opposed not only by Baldwin's government, but by the governments of the dominions, whose consent was required. This opposition, the refusal of the dominions to accept the marriage, added to the weight against the union, the opposition extending across the empire, and making the marriage impossible, not only in Britain, but throughout the dominions. Edward explored a possible compromise, the idea of a morganatic marriage that would allow him to marry Wallis without making her queen, but this proposal too was rejected. Edward proposed the possibility of a morganatic marriage, a union in which he would marry Wallis, but she would not become queen, taking instead some lesser title, the children of the marriage excluded from the succession. This proposal was an attempt to find a way through the crisis, a compromise that might allow Edward to marry Wallis without the full consequences of making a twice-divorced American the queen. But the proposal was rejected, the government and the dominions unwilling to accept even this compromise, the morganatic marriage deemed impossible under the Constitution and unacceptable to the establishment. The rejection of the morganatic marriage, the refusal of the government and the dominions to accept even this compromise, closed off the last possible way through the crisis, leaving Edward with the stark choice between Wallis and the throne. The exploration of the morganatic marriage and its rejection thus narrowed the crisis to its essential choice, the failure of the compromise leaving Edward to choose between the woman he was determined to marry and the throne he had inherited. The support that Edward received, the small group who took his side in the crisis, was limited, the king finding few allies in his determination to marry Wallis. Edward had few allies in the crisis, the establishment largely united against the marriage, the king finding little support for his determination to marry Wallis. There was a small group who took Edward's side, a faction sometimes called the King's Party, who supported his desire to marry Wallis and remain on the throne. The most notable of Edward's allies was Winston Churchill, then out of power, who took the king's side in the crisis, urging caution and delay, hoping to find a way through that would allow Edward to keep both Wallis and the throne. But the support that Edward received was limited. Churchill and the small King's Party unable to overcome the weight of establishment opinion against the marriage, the king finding few allies in his determination to marry Wallis. The limited support that Edward received, the small group who took his side, was insufficient to overcome the opposition to the marriage. The king largely isolated in his determination to marry Wallis against the united opposition of the establishment. The choice that the crisis forced upon Edward was stark and simple, the choice between Wallis and the throne, with no compromise available and no way to have both. The crisis came down, in the end, to a stark and simple choice, the choice between the woman Edward was determined to marry and the throne he had inherited. There was no compromise available, the morganatic marriage having been rejected, no way for Edward to have both Wallis and the throne. He had to choose, to decide whether he would give up Wallis or give up the throne, the crisis forcing the stark and simple choice between the woman and the crown. This choice, between Wallis and the throne, was the essential matter that the crisis forced upon Edward, the stark and simple decision that he would have to make, the choice between the woman he was determined to marry and the throne he had inherited. Edward's response to this choice, his fixed determination to have Wallis whatever the cost, revealed the completeness of the obsession that drove him. Faced with the choice between Wallis and the throne, Edward was resolved to have Wallis, fixed in his determination to marry her whatever the cost, unwilling to give her up, even to keep the throne. He would not be moved from his determination, would not give up Wallis, would not accept any outcome that did not include the woman he was determined to marry. This fixed determination, the resolve to have Wallis whatever the cost, revealed the completeness of the obsession that drove Edward, the totality of his dependence on Wallis, leading him to choose her over the throne. The obsession was so complete, the dependence so total, that Edward would give up the throne rather than give up Wallis, his fixed determination to have her whatever the cost, revealing the completeness of the obsession that had consumed him. The fixed determination that Edward displayed, the resolve to have Wallis whatever the cost, must be understood in light of the deeper truth that he did not want the throne. The determination to marry Wallis, combining with the unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, to make the choice an easy one. Edward's determination to have Wallis whatever the cost was, in one sense, a measure of the completeness of his obsession, the totality of his dependence on the woman he was determined to marry. But it was also, in light of the deeper truth that Edward did not want the throne, a less heroic thing than it might appear. The determination to marry Wallis, combining with the unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, to make the choice between the woman and the crown, an easier one than the romantic legend supposes. If Edward did not want the throne, then the choice between Wallis and the crown was not the agonizing sacrifice that the legend supposes, but a choice made easier by his unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne. The determination to marry Wallis, combining with the desire to escape the burden of kingship, the fixed determination that Edward displayed, must thus be understood in light of this deeper truth. The resolve to have Wallis whatever the cost, combining with the unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, to make the choice an easier one than the romantic legend allows. The crisis, then, forced upon Edward the choice between Wallis and the throne, and his fixed determination to have Wallis, combined with his unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, set the stage for the abdication that would end his reign. The confrontation between Edward's determination to marry Wallis and the constitutional impossibility of that marriage had narrowed to the stark choice between the woman and the crown, and Edward, resolved to have Wallis whatever the cost, and unwilling to bear the burden of the throne, was set upon the course that would lead to the abdication. How the abdication itself unfolded, how Edward renounced the throne and explained his decision to the world, and how the renunciation appeared as both the sacrifice that the legend supposes and the escape that the deeper truth reveals, is where the story turns next. That abdication, the renunciation and the escape, is where we go now. The abdication came on the 10th and 11th of December 1936, the formal renunciation of the throne that brought Edward's brief reign to its end. It was an event without precedent in British history, the voluntary renunciation of the crown by a reigning sovereign, and it has been remembered ever since as the great romantic sacrifice, the king who gave up his throne for love. But the abdication, examined honestly, was as much an escape as a sacrifice, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear, and even Edward himself, in later years, would hint at the relief that accompanied his renunciation. The formal mechanism of the abdication was the Instrument of Abdication, the document by which Edward renounced the throne, signed on the 10th of December, 1936. Edward executed the Instrument of Abdication, the formal document declaring his renunciation of the throne, his irrevocable determination to give up the crown for himself and his descendants. The instrument was signed on the 10th of December, the formal act by which Edward renounced the throne, the document that embodied his decision to give up the crown. This formal mechanism, the Instrument of Abdication signed on the 10th of December, was the means by which Edward renounced the throne, the document that gave legal form to his decision to give up the crown for himself and his descendants. The signing of the instrument was the decisive act of the abdication, the formal renunciation of the throne that brought Edward's reign toward its end. The Instrument of Abdication was given legal effect by an Act of Parliament, the legislation passed on the 11th of December that made the renunciation legally binding. The Instrument of Abdication, the document by which Edward renounced the throne, was given legal effect by an Act of Parliament, the legislation that made the renunciation legally binding and excluded Edward and his descendants from the succession. The act was passed on the 11th of December, the day after Edward signed the instrument, the legislation that gave legal force to the renunciation and brought Edward's reign to its formal end. By this Act of Parliament, Edward and any children he might have were excluded from the succession. The renunciation made legally binding, and the throne passed to Edward's brother. The Act of Parliament, passed on the 11th of December, thus gave legal effect to the abdication, the legislation that made Edward's renunciation binding and brought his reign to its formal end. The famous broadcast in which Edward explained his decision to the world, delivered on the night of the 11th of December, gave the abdication its enduring place in the popular memory. On the night of the 11th of December, no longer king, Edward spoke to the world in a radio broadcast, explaining his decision to abdicate, the speech that would become one of the most famous ever delivered by a British royal. In the broadcast, Edward declared that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of his duties without the help and support of the woman he loved, the words that captured the romantic story of a king who had given up his throne for love. He added that the decision had been his alone, and that the woman most nearly concerned had tried to the last to persuade him to take a different course. The broadcast, delivered on the night of the 11th of December, gave the abdication its enduring place in the popular memory, Edward's explanation of his decision becoming one of the most famous speeches in British history, the words that captured the romantic legend of the king who gave up his throne for love. The words of the broadcast, with their emphasis on the burden of duty and the support of the woman he loved, are worth examining, because they contain, beneath the romantic framing, a revealing acknowledgement of the burden that Edward could not bear. Edward's declaration that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of his duties without the support of the woman he loved is usually read as a romantic statement, the king explaining that he could not bear the throne without the woman he loved at his side. But the words contain, beneath this romantic framing, a revealing acknowledgement, the admission that Edward found the burden of his duties heavy, that he could not carry it, that the role of king was a burden he found difficult to bear. The emphasis on the heavy burden of his duties, the acknowledgement that he found it impossible to carry, reveals beneath the romantic framing the truth of Edward's unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne, the admission that the role of king was a burden he found heavy and difficult to bear. The words of the broadcast thus contain, beneath their romantic framing, a revealing acknowledgement of the burden that Edward could not bear, the emphasis on the heavy burden of his duties, revealing the truth of his unwillingness to bear the role of king. The departure of Edward from Britain, his leaving for the continent the day after the broadcast, marked the end of his reign and the beginning of his exile. The day after the broadcast, Edward left Britain, departing for the continent, beginning the exile that would last for the rest of his life. He travelled to Austria, where he would stay with friends, kept apart from Wallis until her divorce became final and they could marry. The departure marked the end of Edward's reign and the beginning of his exile, the former king leaving the country he had ruled for less than 11 months, beginning the long exile that would follow his abdication. This departure, Edward's leaving for the continent the day after the broadcast, marked the end of his reign and the beginning of his exile, the former king departing the country he had ruled, beginning the exile that would last for the rest of his life. The historical significance of the abdication, the unprecedented nature of the event, lies in its being the only voluntary renunciation of the crown by a reigning British sovereign. The abdication of Edward VIII was an event without precedent in British history, the only instance of a reigning sovereign voluntarily renouncing the crown. Other monarchs had been deposed, forced from their thrones by rebellion or revolution, but no reigning British sovereign had ever voluntarily renounced the crown as Edward did. The abdication was thus a unique event, the only voluntary renunciation of the throne by a reigning British sovereign, the unprecedented act that gave Edward his singular place in the history of the monarchy. This historical significance, the unprecedented nature of the abdication, lies in its being the only voluntary renunciation of the crown by a reigning British sovereign, the unique event that distinguished Edward's reign and gave him his singular place in the history of the monarchy. The honest understanding of the abdication, beneath the romantic legend, is that it was as much an escape as a sacrifice, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear. The romantic legend treats the abdication as a tragic sacrifice, the heartbreaking renunciation of a beloved throne for the sake of love. But the honest understanding, in light of the truth that Edward did not want the throne, is that the abdication was as much an escape as a sacrifice, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear, the way out of a role that Edward found intolerable. The abdication freed Edward from the burden of the throne that he had found so heavy, released him from the duties that he had found so tedious, allowed him to escape the role that he could not bear. This honest understanding, the recognition that the abdication was as much an escape as a sacrifice, transforms the romantic legend, the renunciation of the throne, appearing not merely as a tragic sacrifice, but as the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear. The acknowledgement that Edward himself would later make, the hint of relief that accompanied his renunciation, supports this honest understanding. In later years, Edward would acknowledge, beneath his declarations of reluctance, a hint of the relief that accompanied his renunciation of the throne. While he maintained that the abdication had been a reluctant act, a sacrifice undertaken with sorrow, there were hints, in his later reflections, of the relief that he felt at being released from the burden of the throne. The acknowledgement of this relief, the hint beneath his declarations of reluctance that he felt released from a burden he could not bear, supports the honest understanding of the abdication as an escape, Edward himself acknowledging, in later years, the relief that accompanied his renunciation. This acknowledgement, the hint of relief beneath the declarations of reluctance, supports the honest understanding of the abdication as the release of an unwilling king, Edward himself acknowledging the relief that accompanied his escape from the burden of the throne. The dual nature of the abdication, as both the sacrifice that the legend supposes and the escape that the deeper truth reveals, is essential to the honest assessment of the event. The abdication was, in one sense, a sacrifice, the renunciation of the throne for the sake of the woman Edward loved, the giving up of the crown that the romantic legend celebrates. But it was also, in light of the truth, that Edward did not want the throne, an escape, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear, the way out of a role that Edward found intolerable. The dual nature of the abdication, as both sacrifice and escape, is essential to the honest assessment, the renunciation of the throne being both the romantic sacrifice that the legend celebrates and the escape from an unwanted burden that the deeper truth reveals. This dual nature, the abdication as both sacrifice and escape, captures the complexity of the event, the renunciation of the throne being both a sacrifice for love and an escape from a burden, the two aspects combining in the unprecedented act that ended Edward's reign. The abdication, then, brought Edward's brief reign to its end, the unprecedented renunciation of the throne that has been remembered as a great romantic sacrifice, but that was, in the honest understanding, as much an escape as a sacrifice. The formal mechanism of the instrument of abdication and the Act of Parliament, the famous broadcast with its revealing acknowledgement of the burden Edward could not bear, the departure for exile, all mark the end of Edward's reign and the unprecedented renunciation of the throne, and the honest understanding of the abdication, as both the sacrifice that the legend celebrates and the escape that the deeper truth reveals, captures the complexity of the event, the renunciation of the throne being both a sacrifice for love and the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear. The abdication thus brought Edward's brief reign to its end, the unprecedented renunciation of the throne that was both sacrifice and escape, the act that would pass the crown to Edward's brother and that would shape the future of the monarchy. The crown that Edward abandoned passed to his brother, the reluctant and unprepared Albert, who would become King George VI, and who would, in the years to come, prove a far better king than the brother who had abandoned the throne. For the abdication did not end the monarchy, but passed it to Edward's brother, the dutiful and steady Albert, who would take up the burden that Edward had cast aside, and who would bear it with a devotion that his brother had conspicuously lacked. How Edward's brother took up the burden of the throne, how the reluctant and unprepared Albert became a far better king than Edward had been, and what the contrast between the two brothers reveals is where the story turns next. That brother, and the burden he took up, is where we go now. The crown that Edward abandoned passed to his younger brother Albert, who became King George VI, and the contrast between the two brothers, the glamorous one who had abandoned the throne and the dutiful one who took it up, is one of the most revealing aspects of the whole story. For Albert, the reluctant and unprepared brother, who had never expected or wanted to be king, would prove a far better sovereign than Edward, bearing the burden that Edward had cast aside, with a devotion and a steadiness that his glamorous brother had conspicuously lacked, and vindicating, in the end, the loss of Edward to the throne. Albert, the brother who took up the crown that Edward abandoned, was in many ways the opposite of his glamorous predecessor, a shyer and less impressive figure who lacked Edward's charm and dazzle. Albert was not the glamorous and charismatic figure that Edward had been, not the dazzling Prince of Wales who had captivated the world. He was a shyer and more retiring man, lacking Edward's easy charm and his magnetic public presence, a less impressive figure in the conventional terms of royal glamour. He was also burdened by a stammer, a speech impediment that made public speaking an ordeal for him, a difficulty that added to his shyness and his lack of the easy confidence that Edward had possessed. Albert was thus, in the conventional terms of royal glamour, a less impressive figure than Edward, a shyer and more retiring man, burdened by a stammer, lacking the charm and the dazzle that had made his brother so celebrated. This contrast between the glamorous Edward and the shyer and less impressive Albert framed the succession, the dazzling brother who had abandoned the throne, replaced by the shyer and more retiring brother who took it up. The reluctance with which Albert took up the throne, the burden thrust upon a man who had never expected or wanted to be king, marked the beginning of his reign. Albert had never expected to be king, had never been prepared for the throne, the abdication thrusting upon him a burden that he had never sought and for which he was not prepared. He was the second son, raised in the expectation that his brother would be king, never groomed for the throne, never prepared for the role that the abdication now forced upon him. The burden was thrust upon him suddenly and unexpectedly, the abdication of his brother making him king against all his expectations, forcing upon him a role that he had never sought and for which he felt unprepared. The reluctance with which Albert took up the throne, the burden thrust upon a man who had never expected or wanted to be king, marked the beginning of his reign, the unprepared brother taking up the crown that his brother had abandoned with a reluctance that reflected the suddenness and the unexpectedness of the burden. Despite his reluctance and his lack of preparation, Albert rose to the burden of the throne, applying himself to the duties of the sovereign with a devotion that his brother had conspicuously lacked. Albert, thrust unprepared onto the throne, rose to the burden, applying himself to the duties of the sovereign with a conscientious devotion. He took up the serious work of the monarch that Edward had neglected, attending faithfully to the business of government, performing the duties of his position with a diligence and a sense of duty that his brother had lacked. He bore the burden of the throne with a steadiness and a conscientiousness that contrasted with Edward's boredom and neglect, applying himself to the role with a devotion that reflected his sense of duty. Despite his reluctance and his lack of preparation, Albert thus rose to the burden of the throne, applying himself to the duties of the sovereign with a conscientious devotion that his brother had conspicuously lacked, the dutiful brother performing the role that the glamorous one had neglected. The contrast between Albert's dutiful devotion and Edward's neglect throws into sharp relief the difference between the two brothers, the one who bore the burden faithfully and the one who had cast it aside. Albert bore the burden of the throne with a faithful devotion, attending to the duties that Edward had neglected, applying himself to the serious work that Edward had found tedious. The contrast between the dutiful Albert and the neglectful Edward throws into sharp relief the difference between the two brothers, the one who bore the burden faithfully and the one who had abandoned it. The conscientious devotion of Albert highlighting the boredom and the neglect of Edward. This contrast reveals the difference in character between the two brothers, the dutiful Albert who bore the burden faithfully and the glamorous Edward who had cast it aside. The conscientious devotion of the one highlighting the unsuitedness and the neglect of the other. The contrast between Albert's dutiful devotion and Edward's neglect thus reveals the difference between the two brothers, the faithful bearing of the burden by Albert, highlighting the unsuitedness and the abandonment of Edward. The supreme test of Albert's kingship came with the Second World War, the conflict that would demand of the king a steadiness and a devotion that Albert provided, and that Edward, by his nature and his sympathies, could not have offered. The war that came in 1939 was the supreme test of the monarchy, demanding of the king a steadiness and a courage and a devotion that would sustain the nation through its ordeal. And Albert, as King George VI, met this test, providing the steady and devoted leadership that the nation needed, remaining in London through the bombing, sharing in the hardships of his people, providing a symbol of steadiness and resolve that sustained the nation through the war. He overcame his stammer to deliver the broadcasts that rallied the nation, bore the burden of the wartime monarchy with a courage and a devotion that won him the respect and the affection of his people. The supreme test of the war thus revealed Albert's qualities as king, the steadiness and the devotion that sustained the nation through its ordeal, the dutiful brother providing the leadership that the nation needed in its darkest hour. The contrast between the steady wartime leadership that Albert provided and the leadership that Edward, by his nature and his sympathies, could not have offered, is one of the most significant aspects of the whole story. Albert provided, through the war, the steady and devoted leadership that the nation needed, the symbol of resolve and steadiness that sustained the people through their ordeal. And Edward, by his nature and his sympathies, could not have provided this leadership. His unwillingness to bear the burden of the throne and his troubling political sympathies making him unsuited to the wartime role that Albert performed so well. The contrast between the steady wartime leadership of Albert and the leadership that Edward could not have offered is one of the most significant aspects of the story. The dutiful brother providing the leadership that the nation needed, while the glamorous brother, by his nature and his sympathies, could not have done so. This contrast reveals the significance of the abdication, the replacement of the unsuitable Edward by the dutiful Albert, ensuring that the nation had, in its darkest hour, the steady leadership that it needed, the dutiful brother providing the wartime leadership that the glamorous brother could not have offered, the restoration of confidence in the monarchy that Albert achieved, the repair of the damage that the abdication had done, was one of the great achievements of his reign. The abdication had shaken the monarchy, had damaged its standing and its dignity, had raised questions about the institution and its future, and Albert, through his dutiful and steady reign, restored confidence in the monarchy, repaired the damage that the abdication had done, demonstrated that the institution could endure and could provide the steady and dignified leadership that the nation valued. He restored the standing of the monarchy, repaired its dignity, demonstrated through his faithful service that the institution remained sound. The restoration of confidence in the monarchy that Albert achieved, the repair of the damage that the abdication had done, was one of the great achievements of his reign, the dutiful brother restoring the standing and the dignity of the institution that the abdication had shaken. This restoration, the repair of the damage that the abdication had done, was a significant achievement, Albert demonstrating through his faithful service that the monarchy could endure and could provide the steady and dignified leadership that the nation valued. The succession that followed from Albert's reign, the passing of the throne in time to his daughter Elizabeth, would prove the wisdom of the outcome that the abdication had produced. Albert's elder daughter Elizabeth became the heir presumptive upon her father's accession, and she would in time become Queen Elizabeth II, the long-reigning monarch whose reign would become one of the most successful in British history. The succession that followed from Albert's reign, the passing of the throne to Elizabeth, would prove the wisdom of the outcome that the abdication had produced, the line of the dutiful Albert providing the monarchs who would serve the nation faithfully through the decades to come. This succession, the passing of the throne to Elizabeth, vindicated the outcome that the abdication had produced, the line of the dutiful brother providing the steady and devoted monarchs who would serve the nation well, the abdication that had removed the unsuitable Edward, ensuring that the throne passed to the line that would serve the nation faithfully. The deeper significance of the contrast between the two brothers, then, is that it vindicates the loss of Edward to the throne, demonstrating that the abdication, far from being a tragedy, produced the better outcome for the monarchy and the nation. The contrast between the glamorous Edward who had abandoned the throne and the dutiful Albert who took it up reveals that the abdication produced the better outcome, the replacement of the unsuitable Edward by the dutiful Albert, ensuring that the nation had the steady and devoted leadership that it needed. The abdication, far from being the tragedy that the romantic legend supposes, produced the better outcome for the monarchy and the nation, the removal of the unsuitable Edward and the accession of the dutiful Albert, ensuring that the throne passed to the better king and the better line. This deeper significance, the vindication of the loss of Edward to the throne, reveals that the abdication produced the better outcome, the contrast between the two brothers demonstrating that the nation was better served by the dutiful Albert than it would have been by the glamorous but unsuitable Edward. The vindication of the loss of Edward to the throne, the demonstration that the abdication produced the better outcome, would be reinforced by the recognition of how dangerous Edward's political sympathies were, the troubling views that made his removal from the throne fortunate for the nation. For the contrast between the two brothers was not only a matter of duty and devotion, but of political judgment. Edward's troubling political sympathies, making his removal from the throne fortunate for a nation that would soon face the test of war. How dangerous Edward's political sympathies were, how his troubling views made his removal from the throne a fortunate thing for the nation, and how the abdication may have spared Britain a king whose sympathies would have been disastrous in the war that was coming, is where the story turns next. Those dangerous sympathies and the fortunate escape is where we go now. The vindication of the loss of Edward to the throne is reinforced by one of the most troubling aspects of his character, his political sympathies, which inclined toward the dictatorships of the 1930s, and which made his removal from the throne fortunate for a nation that would soon face the test of war. The matter requires careful handling, distinguishing the documented facts from the speculative claims, but the documented record alone establishes that Edward held political views troubling enough to make his removal from the throne a fortunate thing for Britain. Edward held political views that inclined toward appeasement, the policy of accommodating the dictatorships of the 1930s rather than confronting them, and these views were known and were a source of concern. Edward was, in his political sympathies, an advocate of appeasement, favoring an accommodation with the dictatorships of Germany and Italy rather than a confrontation with them. He expressed views that aligned with the appeasement of the dictators, suggesting that Britain should come to terms with the regimes rather than oppose them, his sympathies inclining toward the accommodation of the dictatorships that were rising in Europe. These views were known, a source of concern to those who recognized the danger of the dictatorships and who worried about the sympathies of a king who favored their accommodation. The political views that Edward held, his inclination toward appeasement, and his sympathy for the accommodation of the dictatorships were thus a source of concern, the king's sympathies aligning with the accommodation of the regimes that would, in time, threaten the nation. The most documented expression of Edward's troubling sympathies was the visit that he and Wallis made to Nazi Germany in 1937, the year after the abdication, a visit that has cast a lasting shadow over his reputation. In October 1937, Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, made a visit to Germany with Wallis, a tour that brought him into contact with the leaders of the Nazi regime. During the visit, Edward met the leaders of the Nazi regime, including Hitler himself, the former King of England received as a guest of the dictatorship. He was photographed giving the Nazi salute, the images of the former king performing the gesture of the regime, providing some of the most damaging evidence of his sympathies. The visit was, in its effect, a propaganda coup for the Nazis. The former King of England, touring Germany as a guest of the regime, lending the prestige of his presence to the dictatorship. This visit, the tour of Nazi Germany in 1937, and the meeting with Hitler and the Nazi salutes, was the most documented expression of Edward's troubling sympathies the former king received as a guest of the dictatorship in a visit that has cast a lasting shadow over his reputation. The enduring nature of Edward's sympathies, the views that he maintained even long after the war, reveals the depth of his troubling inclinations. Edward maintained his troubling sympathies even long after the war, expressing views that revealed the depth of his inclinations. He continued, even decades after the war, to express a certain regard for Hitler, suggesting that his view of the dictator had not been entirely negative, his remarks revealing the persistence of his troubling sympathies. He maintained, by some accounts, that the war could have been avoided, that his own approach would have prevented the conflict, the claims revealing the persistence of his belief in the accommodation of the dictatorship. These enduring sympathies, the views that Edward maintained even long after the war, reveal the depth of his troubling inclinations, the persistence of his regard for the dictator, and his belief in the accommodation of the regime, revealing how deep his troubling sympathies ran. The enduring nature of these sympathies, the views that Edward maintained even decades after the war, thus reveals the depth of his troubling inclinations, the persistence of his sympathies, confirming how troubling his political views were. The wartime concerns about Edward, the worry that the Germans might make use of him, reflected the seriousness with which his sympathies were regarded during the conflict. When the war came, and France fell to the Germans in 1940, Edward and Wallis, who had been living in France, fled south, traveling through Spain to Portugal. And in Portugal, Edward became the subject of German designs, the regime recognizing in the former King of England a figure who might be useful to their purposes. There were German contacts and schemes involving Edward during his time in Portugal, the regime hoping to make use of the former king, even, by some accounts, to position him as a potential puppet should Germany succeed in subduing Britain. These wartime concerns, the worry that the Germans might make use of Edward, reflected the seriousness with which his sympathies were regarded during the conflict, the former king's troubling inclinations making him a figure of concern and a potential instrument of German designs. The wartime concerns about Edward thus reflected the seriousness of his troubling sympathies, the worry that the Germans might make use of him, revealing the danger that his inclinations posed during the conflict. The response of the British government to the concerns about Edward, the decision to send him far away to a remote colonial posting, reflected the determination to keep him out of the way during the war. The British government, with Winston Churchill now Prime Minister, decided to remove Edward from Europe, to send him far away where he could not be used by the Germans or do harm through his sympathies. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas, a remote colonial posting far from the war and far from the German sphere of influence. The appointment was, in effect, a way of getting Edward out of the way, of removing him from Europe where his sympathies might be dangerous, of sending him to a distant posting where he could do no harm. This response, the decision to send Edward to a remote colonial posting, reflected the determination to keep him out of the way during the war, the British government removing the former king to a distant posting where his troubling sympathies could do no harm. The appointment to the Bahamas, the sending of Edward far away to a remote colonial posting, thus reflected the seriousness with which his sympathies were regarded, the British government determining to keep the former king out of the way during the war. A warning that Churchill issued to Edward during the war, a caution about the implications of his remarks, reflected the continuing concern about his sympathies even after he had been sent away. Even after Edward had been sent to the Bahamas, the concern about his sympathies continued, and Churchill found it necessary to warn him about the implications of his remarks. Churchill cautioned Edward that some of his remarks could be interpreted as contemplating an accommodation with the enemy, the warning reflecting the continuing concern about the former king's troubling sympathies. This warning, the caution that Churchill issued to Edward about the implications of his remarks, reflected the continuing concern about his sympathies even after he had been sent away, the former king's troubling inclinations remaining a source of concern even in his distant posting. The warning from Churchill thus reflected the persistence of the concern about Edward's sympathies, the caution about the implications of his remarks, revealing that his troubling inclinations remained a source of concern even after he had been removed from Europe. It is essential, in weighing all of this, to distinguish clearly between the documented facts and the speculative claims, because the difference is crucial to a fair judgment. The documented facts are troubling enough: the visit to Nazi Germany and the meeting with Hitler, the appeasement views, the enduring sympathies, the wartime concerns and the German designs, the warning from Churchill. These are established, and they constitute a genuine and troubling record, evidence of political sympathies that made Edward's removal from the throne a fortunate thing for the nation. But there are also speculative claims, the suggestions that Edward was a traitor, that he actively collaborated with the enemy, that he was removed from the throne by a conspiracy that recognized the danger he posed. These speculative claims go beyond what the evidence establishes, remaining unproven, and a fair judgment must distinguish them from the documented facts. The documented record establishes troubling sympathies, but it does not establish active treason, and the claims that Edward was a traitor or was removed by a conspiracy remain speculative, going beyond what the evidence can support. A fair judgment must thus distinguish the documented facts, which are troubling enough, from the speculative claims, which go beyond the evidence. acknowledging the genuine and troubling record while recognizing the limits of what the evidence establishes. The honest assessment of Edward's political sympathies, then, is that the documented record alone, without the speculative claims, establishes that he held views troubling enough to make his removal from the throne a fortunate thing for the nation. The documented facts, the visit to Nazi Germany, and the appeasement views, and the enduring sympathies, and the wartime concerns, establish that Edward held political sympathies that were genuinely troubling, that inclined toward the accommodation of the dictatorships, that made him a figure of concern during the war. And these documented facts, without the speculative claims of treason or conspiracy, are sufficient to establish that Edward's removal from the throne was a fortunate thing for the nation, the king's troubling sympathies making his abdication a deliverance for a country that would soon face the test of war. The honest assessment, distinguishing the documented facts from the speculative claims, thus establishes that Edward held views troubling enough to make his removal from the throne fortunate, the documented record of his sympathies sufficient to demonstrate the wisdom of the outcome that the abdication had produced. The fortunate nature of Edward's removal from the throne, in light of his troubling sympathies, reinforces the vindication of the abdication, the recognition that the nation was better served by the dutiful Albert than it would have been by the unsuitable and troublingly sympathetic Edward. The contrast between the two brothers, already revealing in the matter of duty and devotion, is reinforced by the matter of political judgment. Edward's troubling sympathies making his removal from the throne fortunate for a nation that would soon face the test of war. Had Edward remained king, the nation would have faced the war with a king whose sympathies inclined toward the accommodation of the enemy, a king whose troubling inclinations might have complicated or compromised the nation's resolve. The fortunate nature of Edward's removal, in light of his troubling sympathies, thus reinforces the vindication of the abdication, the recognition that the nation was better served by the dutiful Albert, who provided the steady wartime leadership that the nation needed, than it would have been by the unsuitable and troublingly sympathetic Edward. This fortunate nature of Edward's removal, the deliverance from a king whose sympathies would have been dangerous in the war, reinforces the vindication of the abdication, the recognition that the outcome the abdication produced was fortunate for a nation that would soon face its greatest test. The deeper truth that emerges from the matter of Edward's political sympathies, then, is that the abdication, far from being a tragedy, may have been a fortunate deliverance for the nation, the removal of a king whose troubling inclinations would have been dangerous in the war that was coming. The abdication removed from the throne a king whose political sympathies were genuinely troubling, whose inclinations toward the accommodation of the dictatorships made him unsuited to the wartime role that the nation would soon require, and the removal of this king, the deliverance from a sovereign whose sympathies would have been dangerous in the war, may have been a fortunate thing for the nation, the abdication producing not a tragedy, but a fortunate deliverance from a king whose troubling inclinations would have been disastrous in the conflict that was coming. This deeper truth, the recognition that the abdication may have been a fortunate deliverance for the nation, reinforces the vindication of the outcome that the abdication produced, the removal of the troublingly sympathetic Edward, and the accession of the dutiful Albert, ensuring that the nation had, in its darkest hour, the steady and devoted leadership that it needed, rather than the troubling sympathies of a king who inclined toward the accommodation of the enemy. The man who had abandoned the throne, whose removal proved so fortunate for the nation, would live out the rest of his life in an exile marked by resentment and diminishment. The glamorous prince, who had given up his crown, reduced to a bitter and purposeless figure. For the abdication that had freed Edward from the burden of the throne did not bring him the happiness or the fulfillment that he might have hoped for, but condemned him instead to an empty and embittered exile, the diminished afterlife of the man who had abandoned his crown. How Edward's exile unfolded, how the glamorous prince was reduced to a bitter and diminished figure, and what his empty afterlife reveals about the choice he had made, is where the story turns next. That exile and the diminished man is where we go now. The abdication that had freed Edward from the burden of the throne did not bring him the happiness or the fulfillment he might have imagined, but condemned him instead to an exile marked by resentment and diminishment. The glamorous prince reduced to a bitter and purposeless figure. The afterlife of Edward's choice, the decades he spent as the Duke of Windsor, revealed the emptiness of what he had grasped. The man who had given up his crown, finding in his exile not contentment, but grievance, not fulfillment, but the slow diminishment of a purposeless life. Edward emerged from the abdication with a new and lesser title, the Duke of Windsor, the designation that marked his reduced status as a former king living in exile. Upon his abdication, Edward was created the Duke of Windsor by his brother, the new king, the title that he would bear for the rest of his life. The dukedom marked his reduced status, the former king now a royal duke, the sovereign who had ruled an empire reduced to a member of the royal family living in exile. This new and lesser title, the Duke of Windsor, marked the reduction of Edward's status, the former king who had abandoned the throne, now a royal duke living in exile, the designation that captured the diminishment of the man who had given up his crown. The title of Duke of Windsor thus marked Edward's reduced status, the former sovereign reduced to a royal duke living in exile, the designation that captured the diminishment of the man who had abandoned the throne. The grievance that dominated Edward's exile, the great resentment that consumed him, was the denial to Wallis of the royal style that he believed should have been hers, the slight that he never ceased to resent. When Edward married Wallis, the royal family denied her the style of Royal Highness, the designation that would normally have followed from her marriage to a royal duke. Edward regarded this denial as a grievous insult to his wife, a deliberate humiliation inflicted upon the woman he loved, and he resented it bitterly, regarding it as the great injustice of his treatment by the royal family. The denial of the royal style to Wallis became the dominant grievance of Edward's exile, the resentment that consumed him, the slight that he never ceased to resent and that poisoned his relationship with his family. This grievance, the denial to Wallis of the royal style that Edward believed should have been hers, dominated his exile, the resentment of the slight consuming him and embittering his relationship with the family that had inflicted it. The grievance over the royal style thus became the great resentment of Edward's exile, the slight to Wallis that he never ceased to resent and that poisoned his years in exile. The self-pity and the grievance that characterized Edward's exile reflected a diminishment of character, the former king consumed by resentment and self-pity, rather than rising above the circumstances of his exile. Edward, in his exile, was consumed by self-pity and grievance, dwelling on the slights he believed he had suffered, nursing his resentments, lamenting the treatment he had received from his family. He did not rise above the circumstances of his exile, did not find a dignified contentment or a purposeful way of life, but sank instead into self-pity and grievance, consumed by his resentments and his sense of having been wronged. This self-pity and grievance reflected a diminishment of character, the former king consumed by resentment, rather than rising above his circumstances, the diminished man dwelling on his slights and nursing his grievances. The self-pity and the grievance that characterized Edward's exile thus reflected a diminishment of character, the former king consumed by resentment and self-pity, rather than finding a dignified way through the circumstances of his exile. The purposelessness of Edward's exile, the empty and aimless life that he led as the Duke of Windsor, reflected the consequence of the abdication that had freed him from the burden of the throne. Edward, in his exile, led a purposeless and aimless life, without the role or the function that the throne had provided, without any meaningful occupation to fill his days. He had given up the throne and the role it provided, and in exchange he had received an empty exile, a life without purpose or function, the former king reduced to an aimless existence with nothing meaningful to occupy him. The purposelessness of his exile reflected the consequence of the abdication, the freeing from the burden of the throne, leaving Edward without any role or function, the man who had abandoned the throne, condemned to an empty and aimless life. This purposelessness, the empty and aimless life that Edward led in his exile, reflected the consequence of the abdication, the freeing from the burden of the throne, leaving him without purpose, the former king reduced to an aimless existence with nothing meaningful to fill his days. The irony of Edward's purposeless exile, in light of the truth that he had not wanted the burden of the throne, is one of the deeper truths of his story. Edward had not wanted the burden of the throne, had found the role of king intolerable, had escaped from the burden through the abdication. And yet the escape from the burden of the throne did not bring him fulfillment or contentment, but condemned him instead to a purposeless and empty exile, a life without the role or the function that the throne had provided. The irony is that the burden Edward had escaped was also the role that might have given his life purpose and meaning, the throne that he had found intolerable being also the source of the function and the significance that his exile lacked. This irony, the purposeless exile of a man who had escaped a burden he did not want, is one of the deeper truths of Edward's story, the escape from the throne, bringing not fulfillment, but a purposeless and empty exile, the burden that Edward had cast aside, being also the role that might have given his life meaning. The contrast between the glamorous prince that Edward had been and the diminished duke that he became is one of the most striking aspects of his story. The dazzling figure of the 1920s reduced to a bitter and purposeless exile. Edward had been, as Prince of Wales, the most glamorous and celebrated figure in the world, the dazzling young prince who captivated the public and set the fashions of his age. And he became, in his exile, a diminished and bitter figure, the former king reduced to a purposeless existence, consumed by grievance and self-pity, leading an empty and aimless life. The contrast between the glamorous prince and the diminished duke is striking. The dazzling figure of the 1920s reduced to the bitter and purposeless exile of the Duke of Windsor, the celebrated young prince become the embittered and aimless former king. This contrast between the glamorous prince that Edward had been and the diminished duke that he became is one of the most striking aspects of his story. The dazzling figure of the 1920s reduced to a bitter and purposeless exile, the celebrated young prince become the embittered and diminished former king. The diminishment of Edward in his exile revealed something about his character, the emptiness and the lack of inner resources that lay beneath the glamorous surface. The Edward who sank into self-pity and grievance in his exile, who failed to rise above his circumstances or to find a dignified and purposeful way of life, revealed an emptiness and a lack of inner resources, a hollowness beneath the glamorous surface. He lacked the inner strength and the resources of character that might have allowed him to rise above the circumstances of his exile, to find a dignified contentment or a purposeful way of life, to bear his reduced status with grace. Instead, he sank into self-pity and grievance, revealing the emptiness and the lack of inner resources that lay beneath the glamorous surface, the hollowness of a man who had nothing within himself to sustain him when the glamour and the celebrity were gone. This diminishment of Edward in his exile thus revealed something about his character, the emptiness and the lack of inner resources that lay beneath the glamorous surface, the hollowness of a man who could not rise above his circumstances when the glamour was gone. The empty afterlife of Edward's choice, the purposeless and embittered exile that followed the abdication, revealed the emptiness of what he had grasped. The man who had given up his crown finding in his exile not contentment, but grievance and diminishment. The abdication had freed Edward from the burden of the throne and had allowed him to marry the woman he loved, but it had not brought him the happiness or the fulfillment that he might have hoped for. Instead, it had condemned him to an empty and embittered exile, a purposeless life consumed by grievance and self-pity. The man who had given up his crown, finding not contentment, but diminishment. The empty afterlife of Edward's choice thus revealed the emptiness of what he had grasped, the abdication bringing not the happiness or the fulfillment that he might have imagined, but a purposeless and embittered exile. The man who had abandoned the throne, finding in his exile not contentment, but grievance and diminishment. This empty afterlife, the purposeless and embittered exile that followed the abdication, revealed the emptiness of what Edward had grasped, the choice that had freed him from the burden of the throne, bringing not fulfillment, but the slow diminishment of a purposeless life. The man who had given up his throne lived out the rest of his life in this diminished exile, the glamorous prince reduced to a bitter and purposeless figure, until his death brought his story to its end. Edward lived out his life as the Duke of Windsor, the diminished and embittered figure of his exile, until his death in 1972 brought his story to its close. He spent the decades of his exile in a purposeless and embittered existence, consumed by grievance and self-pity, the glamorous prince reduced to a bitter and diminished figure, until his death ended the long afterlife of his choice. The man who had given up his throne thus lived out the rest of his life in his diminished exile, the glamorous prince reduced to a bitter and purposeless figure, until his death brought his story to its end, the empty afterlife of his choice continuing until the death that ended his long exile. The story of Edward VIII, then, comes toward its reckoning, the glamorous prince who abandoned his throne and found in his exile not contentment but diminishment, the man whose choice revealed the emptiness beneath the glamorous surface, the making of the unsuitable heir, the glamour that concealed the flaws, the obsession that drove the abdication, the king who did not want to be king, the abdication that was as much escape as sacrifice, the dutiful brother who took up the burden and did it better, the dangerous sympathies that made the removal fortunate, the empty and embittered exile, all come together in the story of Edward VIII, the glamorous prince who could not, or would not, be a king. How the whole story should finally be understood, what the honest reckoning with Edward reveals, and what the verdict of history on the man and his choice amounts to, is where the story comes to its close. That final reckoning, the verdict on Edward, is where we go now. The story of Edward VIII comes, at last, to its reckoning, and the honest verdict on the man and his choice is one that inverts the romantic legend that has surrounded him for nearly a century. For when the legend of the king who gave up his throne for love is set against the documented reality, what emerges is the story not of a tragic romantic hero, but of a glamorous but shallow and unsuitable man who failed at the one role he was born to fill, who abandoned his duty as much from unwillingness as from love, and whose departure was, in the end, a fortunate thing for the nation he had been meant to serve. The honest verdict on Edward must begin with the recognition that the romantic legend, the story of the king who sacrificed his throne for love, is profoundly misleading, obscuring the reality of a man unsuited to and unwilling to bear the role he had inherited. The legend treats the abdication as a tragic sacrifice, the heartbreaking renunciation of a beloved throne for the sake of love, casting Edward as a romantic hero who gave up everything for the woman he loved. But the documented reality, as we have seen, is profoundly different. The story of a man who was unsuited to the throne from his earliest years, who did not want the burden of kingship, who neglected his duties and disregarded the responsibilities of his position, and for whom the abdication was as much an escape from an unwanted burden as a sacrifice for love. The honest verdict must thus begin by setting aside the romantic legend, recognizing that the story of the king who sacrificed his throne for love obscures the reality of a man unsuited to and unwilling to bear the role he had inherited. The reality of Edward's character, beneath the glamorous surface, was that of a shallow and self-absorbed man, charming and stylish, but lacking the substance and the depth that his position demanded. Edward was, beneath the glamour and the charm, a shallow and superficial man, lacking the depth and the substance and the seriousness that the role of king required. He was charming and stylish, the dazzling prince who captivated the world, but the charm was a surface quality, concealing a hollowness and a lack of inner resources beneath. He was self-absorbed, consumed by his own desires and his own grievances, lacking the selflessness and the devotion to duty that his position demanded. The reality of Edward's character, beneath the glamorous surface, was thus that of a shallow and self-absorbed man, charming and stylish, but lacking the substance and the depth and the seriousness that his position required. The hollowness beneath the glamour, revealing the unsuitedness of the man for the role he had inherited. The unsuitedness of Edward for the throne, the temperamental unfitness that had been apparent from his earliest years, was the fundamental truth that the abdication confirmed. Edward had shown, from his childhood, signs of being temperamentally unsuited to the throne, lacking the gravity and the discipline and the application that the role of king required. This unsuitedness had been recognized by his father, who had foreseen that Edward would ruin himself and had favored the dutiful Albert over the unsuitable heir, and the unsuitedness was confirmed by Edward's brief and troubled reign, the neglect of duty and the disregard for the responsibilities of the sovereign, demonstrating that the unsuitable heir was indeed unfit to be king. The unsuitedness of Edward for the throne, the temperamental unfitness apparent from his earliest years and confirmed by his troubled reign, was thus the fundamental truth that the abdication revealed, the unsuitable heir fulfilling his unsuitedness by abandoning the throne he was unfit to bear. The neglect of duty and the mishandling of the secret papers of state, the genuine failings of Edward's reign, demonstrated that his unsuitedness was not merely a matter of temperament, but of genuine danger to the nation. Edward's reign was marked not only by his temperamental unsuitedness, but by genuine failings, the neglect of his official duties, and the careless mishandling of the secret papers of state. These failings were not merely matters of style or temperament, but genuine dangers. The mishandling of the confidential documents of the government, threatening the security of the nation, the exposure of the secrets of state to Wallis and to the foreign diplomats who socialized with the king, creating a genuine risk. The neglect of duty and the mishandling of the secret papers thus demonstrated that Edward's unsuitedness was not merely a matter of temperament, but of genuine danger to the nation, the failings of his reign creating real risks that confirmed his unfitness for the throne. The abdication, in the honest understanding, was as much an escape as a sacrifice, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear, rather than the tragic renunciation of a beloved throne. The romantic legend treats the abdication as a tragic sacrifice, but the honest understanding, in light of the truth that Edward did not want the throne, is that it was as much an escape as a sacrifice, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he found intolerable. The abdication freed Edward from the burden of the throne that he had found so heavy, released him from the duties that he had found so tedious, allowed him to escape the role that he could not bear. And Wallis functioned, in this understanding, as both the reason and the means of Edward's escape, the obsession with her giving him both the motive to abandon the throne and the mechanism for the release from a burden he could not bear. The abdication, in the honest understanding, was thus as much an escape as a sacrifice, the release of an unwilling king from a burden he could not bear, the obsession with Wallis providing both the reason and the means of his escape. The fortunate nature of Edward's departure, in light of his troubling political sympathies, transforms the abdication from a tragedy into a deliverance for the nation. The documented record of Edward's political sympathies, his inclination toward appeasement, and his troubling regard for the dictatorships established that he held views troubling enough to make his removal from the throne a fortunate thing for the nation. Had Edward remained king, the nation would have faced the war with a king whose sympathies inclined toward the accommodation of the enemy, a king whose troubling inclinations might have complicated or compromised the nation's resolve. The fortunate nature of Edward's departure, in light of his troubling sympathies, thus transforms the abdication from a tragedy into a deliverance, the removal of a king whose inclinations would have been dangerous in the war, producing not a loss, but a fortunate escape for the nation. The abdication, far from being the tragedy that the romantic legend supposes, was thus a fortunate deliverance for the nation, the removal of the troublingly sympathetic Edward, sparing Britain a king whose inclinations would have been disastrous in the war that was coming. The vindication of the abdication by the success of those who followed, the dutiful Albert and his daughter Elizabeth, confirms that the nation was better served by the loss of Edward than it would have been by his continued reign. The abdication passed the throne to the dutiful Albert, who proved a far better king than Edward had been, bearing the burden of the throne with a devotion that his brother had lacked, and providing the steady wartime leadership that the nation needed. And the throne passed in time to Albert's daughter Elizabeth, whose long reign would become one of the most successful in British history. The success of those who followed Edward, the dutiful Albert and his daughter Elizabeth, vindicates the abdication, confirming that the nation was better served by the loss of Edward than it would have been by his continued reign. This vindication, the success of the dutiful Albert and his daughter Elizabeth, confirms the wisdom of the outcome that the abdication had produced, the nation better served by the loss of the unsuitable Edward and the accession of the line that would serve it faithfully. The honest verdict on Edward, then, must resist both the romantic legend that casts him as a tragic hero and any simple condemnation that would deny his genuine qualities, recognizing him as a complicated figure who failed at the role he was born to fill. Edward was not the tragic romantic hero of the legend, the king who sacrificed everything for love, because the reality of his unsuitedness and his unwillingness and his troubling sympathies belies that romantic framing. But neither was he simply a villain, a wholly contemptible figure without redeeming qualities, because he possessed genuine charm and a genuine if superficial sympathy, and he was shaped by a cold upbringing that did much to create the needy and unsuitable man he became, and he felt a genuine love for Wallis that drove his choice. The honest verdict must thus resist both the romantic legend and any simple condemnation, recognizing Edward as a complicated figure, a man of genuine charm and genuine flaws, shaped by a cold upbringing and driven by a genuine love, but unsuited to and unwilling to bear the role he was born to fill, a man who failed at the one role for which his entire life had been intended. The deeper truth that the story of Edward reveals, beyond the particulars of his life, is the gap between the glamour of a public image and the substance that a serious role requires, the lesson that charm and style are no substitute for the depth and the duty that genuine responsibility demands. Edward was the most glamorous and celebrated figure of his age, the dazzling prince who captivated the world with his charm and his style. But the glamour concealed a hollowness, a lack of the substance and the depth and the seriousness that the role of king required. And when the time came for Edward to bear the genuine responsibility of the throne, the glamour proved no substitute for the substance that the role demanded. The deeper truth that the story reveals is thus the gap between the glamour of a public image and the substance that a serious role requires, the lesson that charm and style are no substitute for the depth and the duty that genuine responsibility demands. The glamorous prince who could captivate the world, but who could not bear the burden of the throne, revealing the emptiness of glamour without substance. When we look back now at the story of Edward VIII, from the cold childhood that shaped him to the empty exile in which he ended, we see not the tragic romantic hero of the legend, but a complicated and in many ways diminished figure, a glamorous prince who failed at the role he was born to fill. We see the unsuitable heir, shaped by a cold upbringing, into an emotionally needy and temperamentally unsuited man. We see the glamorous prince, dazzling and charming, but hollow beneath the surface. We see the obsessed and dependent man, utterly in thrall to a dominating woman. We see the unwilling king, bored by his duties and unable to bear the burden of the throne. We see the man who abandoned his throne as much from unwillingness as from love, whose departure was a fortunate thing for the nation. And we see the diminished exile, consumed by grievance and self-pity, the glamorous prince reduced to a bitter and purposeless figure. When we look back at the story of Edward VIII, we see not the tragic romantic hero of the legend, but this complicated and diminished figure, the glamorous prince who could not, or would not, be a king. The affair with a married American did not, in the end, simply cost Edward the throne, as the romantic legend supposes, because the throne was not something Edward lost to love, but something he was unsuited to hold, and arguably glad to set down. The romantic legend frames the abdication as a tragedy, the king who lost his throne to love, but the deeper truth inverts this framing entirely. The throne was a burden that Edward was unsuited to bear and unwilling to carry, a role at which he was failing and from which he was arguably glad to escape, and the affair with Wallis gave him not only a reason to abandon the throne, but a means of escaping a burden he could not bear. The affair did not simply cost Edward the throne then, but provided him with the escape from a role he was unsuited to and unwilling to fill, the abdication being as much a deliverance as a loss, both for Edward and for the nation he had been meant to serve. In the end, the story of Edward VIII is not the great romance that the legend supposes, the king who sacrificed his throne for love, but the more complicated and more sobering story of a glamorous but unsuitable man who failed at the role he was born to fill, and who was, in his abandonment of that role, a fortunate loss for the nation he had been meant to serve. It is the story of a man shaped by a cold upbringing into emotional neediness and temperamental unsuitedness, a glamorous prince whose charm concealed a hollowness beneath, an obsessed and dependent man who abandoned his throne as much from unwillingness as from love, a king whose troubling sympathies made his departure fortunate, and a diminished exile consumed by grievance and self-pity. Edward VIII was the glamorous prince who could not, or would not, be a king, and the nation that he abandoned was, in the end, better served by his departure than it would have been by his continued reign. The dutiful brother who took up the burden and the line that followed vindicating the loss of the glamorous but unsuitable man who had given up his crown. He was the most celebrated prince of his age, the dazzling figure who captivated the world, and he ended as a diminished and embittered exile, the glamorous prince who had failed at the one role he was born to fill. The throne that he abandoned passed to better hands, and the nation that he left was better served by his departure than it would have been by his reign. And the legend of the king who gave up his throne for love, the romantic story that has surrounded Edward for nearly a century, obscures the more complicated and more sobering truth, the truth of a glamorous but unsuitable man who could not, or would not, bear the burden of the crown, and whose abandonment of the throne was, in the end, a fortunate deliverance for the nation he had been meant to serve. Edward VIII, the glamorous prince who could not be a king, found in his abandonment of the throne not the tragedy of the legend, but the escape of an unwilling man from a burden he could not bear, and the nation he left behind found, in his departure, not a loss, but a fortunate deliverance. The story of Edward's character does not end with his abandonment of the throne, because his conduct in the years that followed, and particularly his dealings with the family he had left behind, revealed the same self-absorption and irresponsibility that had marked his reign. The man who had given up his crown then refused, in significant ways, to accept the consequences of his own choice, harassing the brother he had burdened, grasping for money under false pretenses, and nursing for decades the grievances of a man who could not take responsibility for his own decision. This conduct, in the aftermath of the abdication, completes the portrait of Edward's character, revealing the self-absorption and the failure of responsibility that lay at its heart. The most revealing of Edward's post-abdication dealings was the dispute over money, the negotiation of his financial settlement with his brother that exposed a grasping and dishonest streak in his character. When Edward abdicated, the question of his financial provision had to be settled, the former king requiring some income to support himself in his exile. The government declined to include Edward on the official list of those supported by public funds, and so his allowance was to be paid personally by his brother, the new king, out of the king's own resources. And in negotiating this allowance, Edward concealed the extent of his own wealth from his brother, misrepresenting his financial position in order to secure a more generous settlement than his actual circumstances warranted. This concealment, the misrepresentation of his wealth in order to secure a generous allowance from his brother, exposed a grasping and dishonest streak in Edward's character, the former king deceiving his brother over money in order to extract a more generous settlement than he needed. The extent of the wealth that Edward concealed, the substantial fortune that he had accumulated and that he hid from his brother, makes the deception all the more striking. Edward had accumulated, over his years as Prince of Wales, a substantial private fortune, savings drawn from the revenues of the Duchy of Cornwall, the income that he had received as heir to the throne. This fortune amounted to a very large sum, more than £1,000,000, a substantial private wealth that Edward had accumulated over his years as Prince of Wales. And this money was, by the ordinary expectation, money that should have passed to the incoming monarch, the revenues of the Duchy of Cornwall being ordinarily at the disposal of the new king. Yet Edward had accumulated and retained this substantial fortune, and he concealed it from his brother, claiming to be in far more modest circumstances than he actually was, misrepresenting his wealth as a fraction of its true extent in order to secure a generous allowance. The extent of the wealth that Edward concealed, the substantial fortune of more than £1,000,000 that he hid while claiming to be in modest circumstances, makes the deception all the more striking, the former king concealing a substantial private fortune in order to extract a generous allowance from his brother under false pretenses. The discovery of the deception, when George VI learned the truth about his brother's wealth, contributed to the bitterness that would mark the relationship between them. When George VI eventually learned the truth about Edward's wealth, that his brother had concealed a substantial fortune while claiming to be in modest circumstances, the discovery contributed to the bitterness that would mark their relationship. The new king, who had been deceived by his brother into providing a generous allowance, learned that Edward had misrepresented his wealth, that the former king had a substantial private fortune that he had concealed. This discovery, the revelation that Edward had deceived him over money, contributed to the bitterness between the brothers, the new king resenting the deception that his brother had practiced upon him. The discovery of the deception thus contributed to the strained relations between the brothers, George VI, resenting the dishonesty that Edward had shown in concealing his wealth in order to extract a generous allowance under false pretenses. The sale of the royal estates that Edward owned, the properties that George VI had to purchase from his brother, added to the financial dealings that strained the relationship. Edward owned, as his personal property inherited from their father, two of the great royal estates, the country houses that were not part of the official royal property and that did not automatically pass to the new king, and George VI, requiring the use of these estates, had to purchase them from his brother, paying Edward a substantial sum for the properties that the new king needed, but that belonged to Edward personally. Edward received a very large sum for these estates, a substantial payment that added to his already considerable wealth, the new king having to buy from his brother the properties that the sovereign required. This sale, the purchase by George VI of the royal estates that Edward owned, added to the financial dealings that strained the relationship, the new king having to pay his brother a substantial sum for the properties that the sovereign needed, the financial transactions adding to the bitterness between them. The sale of the estates, with Edward extracting a large payment from his brother for the properties the new king required, thus added to the financial dealings that strained the relationship between the brothers. The conduct that Edward displayed in the early days of his brother's reign, the daily telephone calls importuning for money and pressing his grievances, revealed a man who could not let go and who undermined the brother he had burdened. In the early days of George VI's reign, when the new king was struggling to take up the burden that Edward had cast aside, Edward telephoned his brother daily, calling repeatedly to press his demands and his grievances. He called to importune for money, to press his financial demands, and to urge that his wife be granted the royal style that had been denied her. The daily calls, the repeated importuning for money, and the pressing of his grievances undermined the new king, who was struggling to establish himself in the role that Edward had abandoned, the former king's constant interference adding to the burden of a brother already struggling with the unexpected weight of the throne. The conduct that Edward displayed, the daily calls importuning for money and pressing his grievances, revealed a man who could not let go, who continued to interfere in the affairs of the brother he had burdened, who undermined the new king with his constant demands. This conduct revealed the self-absorption of Edward, the former king unable to let go, importuning his struggling brother with daily demands for money and the pressing of his grievances. The resolution of this interference, the order that George VI eventually gave that his brother's calls should no longer be put through, captures the strain that Edward's conduct placed on the relationship. The daily calls from Edward, the constant importuning for money, and the pressing of his grievances became so burdensome that George VI eventually ordered that his brother's calls should no longer be put through, that the telephone calls should be stopped. This order, the decision of the harassed king that his brother's calls should be blocked, captures the strain that Edward's conduct had placed on the relationship. The new king driven to block the calls of a brother whose constant demands had become intolerable. The resolution of the interference, the order that the calls should be stopped, captures the breakdown of the relationship between the brothers. George VI, driven to block the calls of a brother whose self-absorbed importuning had become a burden too great to bear. This order, the blocking of Edward's calls, captures the strain that his conduct had placed on the relationship. The new king forced to cut off a brother whose constant demands had become intolerable. The grievance over the denial of the royal style to his wife, the resentment that Edward nursed for decades, poisoned his relationship with his family and consumed him with bitterness. The denial to Wallis of the royal style, the designation that Edward believed should have been hers, became the great grievance of his life. The resentment that he nursed for decades and that poisoned his relationship with his family. Edward regarded the denial as a deliberate insult to his wife, an injustice that he could not forgive, and he campaigned relentlessly for its reversal, pressing his family to grant Wallis the royal style, nursing his resentment when they refused. This grievance, the resentment over the denial of the royal style, consumed Edward for decades, poisoning his relationship with his family, the former king unable to forgive the slight to his wife, and unable to let go of his resentment. The grievance over the royal style thus poisoned Edward's relationship with his family. The resentment that he nursed for decades consuming him with bitterness and embittering his dealings with the family that had inflicted the slight. The estrangement from his mother, the cold relationship between Edward and Queen Mary, reflected the breakdown of his family relationships in the aftermath of the abdication. Edward's relationship with his mother, Queen Mary, was strained and cold in the aftermath of the abdication. The formidable matriarch, unable to forgive her son for abandoning the throne and unwilling to accept his wife. Queen Mary regarded the abdication as a betrayal of duty, a dereliction of the responsibility that Edward had been born to bear, and she never forgave him for it, regarding his abandonment of the throne as an unforgivable failure of duty, and she never accepted Wallis, refusing to receive her, declining to acknowledge the woman for whom Edward had given up the throne. This estrangement from his mother, the cold relationship with Queen Mary, who could not forgive the abdication and would not accept his wife, reflected the breakdown of Edward's family relationships. The former king estranged from the mother, who regarded his abandonment of the throne as an unforgivable betrayal of duty. The estrangement from his mother thus reflected the breakdown of Edward's family relationships, the cold relationship with Queen Mary, capturing the rupture that the abdication had caused. The expectation that Edward had held, that he would return to Britain after a short period of exile, and the reality that he was effectively kept in permanent exile, contributed to his bitterness and revealed his failure to grasp the consequences of his own choice. Edward had assumed, at the time of the abdication, that he would return to Britain after a year or two of exile, that he would be able to resume some place in British life after a brief absence. But the reality was very different. The former king, effectively kept in permanent exile, denied the return to Britain that he had expected, kept away from the country he had ruled and the family he had left behind. This gap between Edward's expectation and the reality, between the brief exile he had assumed and the permanent exile he received, contributed to his bitterness, the former king resenting the permanent exile that he had not anticipated, and it revealed his failure to grasp the consequences of his own choice. Edward, having assumed that he could abandon the throne and then return to British life after a brief absence, failing to understand that his abandonment of the throne would consign him to a permanent exile. This gap between expectation and reality, between the brief exile Edward had assumed and the permanent exile he received, thus contributed to his bitterness and revealed his failure to grasp the consequences of his own choice. The deeper truth that Edward's post-abdication conduct reveals, the truth that completes the portrait of his character, is that he could not accept the consequences of his own choice, blaming and resenting his family for the situation that his own decision had created. Edward had made his choice, had abandoned the throne for the sake of his obsession with Wallis, had renounced the crown of his own free will, but he could not accept the consequences of this choice, could not reconcile himself to the exile and the reduced status and the family estrangement that his decision had produced. Instead, he blamed and resented his family, nursing his grievances over the royal style and the financial settlement and the permanent exile, holding his family responsible for the consequences of his own decision. This failure to accept the consequences of his own choice, the blaming and resenting of his family for the situation that his own decision had created, completes the portrait of Edward's character, revealing the self-absorption and the failure of responsibility that lay at its heart. The deeper truth that Edward's post-abdication conduct reveals is thus that he could not accept the consequences of his own choice. The former king blaming and resenting his family for the situation that his own decision had produced, the self-absorption and the failure of responsibility completing the portrait of his character. The self-absorption that Edward displayed in his dealings with his family, the inability to take responsibility for his own decision, was continuous with the character that had marked his reign and his abandonment of the throne. The Edward who concealed his wealth from his brother, who harassed the new king with daily demands, who nursed his grievances for decades, who blamed his family for the consequences of his own choice, was the same Edward who had neglected his duties as king, who had been unwilling to bear the burden of the throne, who had abandoned the role he was born to fill. The self-absorption and the failure of responsibility that marked his post-abdication conduct were continuous with the character that had marked his reign. The same self-centeredness and the same inability to take responsibility appearing in his dealings with his family as in his abandonment of the throne. This continuity, the self-absorption, and the failure of responsibility that marked both his reign and his post-abdication conduct reveals the consistency of Edward's character, the same flaws appearing throughout his life, the self-centeredness and the irresponsibility that marked his abandonment of the throne, continuing in his dealings with the family he had left behind. The portrait of Edward's character that his post-abdication conduct completes is thus a sobering one, the portrait of a self-absorbed and irresponsible man who could not accept the consequences of his own choice and who blamed and resented his family for the situation that his own decision had created. The man who had abandoned his throne then refused to accept the consequences of his choice, concealing his wealth from his brother, harassing the new king with daily demands, nursing his grievances for decades, blaming his family for the exile and the reduced status that his own decision had produced. This conduct completes the portrait of Edward's character, revealing the self-absorption and the failure of responsibility that lay at its heart, the consistency of the flaws that marked his life. And the portrait that emerges is a sobering one, the portrait of a self-absorbed and irresponsible man who could not take responsibility for his own decision, who blamed his family for the consequences of his own choice, whose character was marked throughout by the self-centeredness and the irresponsibility that his abandonment of the throne had revealed. This portrait of Edward's character, completed by his post-abdication conduct, reinforces the honest verdict on the man and his choice, confirming that the romantic legend of the king who sacrificed his throne for love obscures the reality of a self-absorbed and irresponsible figure who failed at the role he was born to fill. The self-absorption and the failure of responsibility that marked Edward's dealings with his family reinforced the honest verdict on the man, confirming that he was not the tragic romantic hero of the legend, but a self-centered and irresponsible figure who could not bear the burden of the throne and could not accept the consequences of his own choice. The romantic legend obscures this reality, casting Edward as a hero who sacrificed everything for love, but the portrait completed by his post-abdication conduct reveals the truth, the self-absorbed and irresponsible man who failed at the role he was born to fill, and who could not accept the consequences of his own decision. This portrait thus reinforces the honest verdict on Edward, confirming that the romantic legend obscures the reality of a self-absorbed and irresponsible figure, the man whose conduct throughout his life revealed the self-centeredness and the failure of responsibility that lay at the heart of his character. The conduct of Edward in the aftermath of the abdication, then, completes the portrait of his character and reinforces the honest verdict on the man and his choice, the self-absorption and the failure of responsibility that marked his dealings with his family, confirming the reality that the romantic legend obscures. The money disputes and the harassment of his brother, the grievance over the royal style and the estrangement from his mother, the failure to accept the consequences of his own choice and the blaming of his family, all complete the portrait of Edward's character, revealing the self-absorption and the failure of responsibility that lay at its heart. And this portrait, the portrait of a self-absorbed and irresponsible man who could not accept the consequences of his own choice, reinforces the honest verdict on Edward, confirming that the romantic legend of the king who sacrificed his throne for love obscures the reality of a figure whose character was marked throughout by self-centeredness and irresponsibility, the glamorous prince who could not or would not be a king, and who could not, in the end, accept the consequences of the choice he had made.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.